Hello everyone and welcome to the second part of the Dry Dock episode 287, aka the Dreg did not fall out of the sky in a burning aircraft and therefore is back to record this installation of 2024. So let's proceed. We are of course doing the second half of the Patreon Dry Dock, so this will run for probably between 2 and 2.5, maybe 3 hours. Let's see how it goes. Zed Stewart asks, a couple of questions related to the Battle of Samar. First, regarding the timing of Halsey turning ships around to help. I know the battleships were too far to help Taffy 3, but just how far away were they? If Kurita had pushed through the defenders to get to the transports, how soon would Lee's ships have arrived? Would they be able to interfere with the attack on the transports, or would they even arrive in time to stop Kurita from escaping after the damage was done? And secondly, and perhaps more interestingly, how far were the nearest fleet carriers from being able to help? If Halsey had turned around some or all of the fleet carriers as soon as reports came in from Taffy 3, how quickly could a concentrated strike from one or more fleet carriers have reached Samar? And finally, how much tactical control did Halsey exercise over the carrier forces? He seemed to have wanted a major carrier versus carrier action, and yet his flagship was one of the battleships. Am I mistaken, or did Halsey sending Task Force 34 back south mean he was effectively removing himself from the carrier battle? Might that have mattered in his decision as to whether to dispatch the battleships, or would tactical control of the carriers have been delegated to subordinates anyway? So yes, Admiral Halsey's flagship was actually USS New Jersey, and obviously that is a battleship. However, whether or not the battleships are sent south under Admiral Lee, obviously Halsey has the authority to dictate which battleships would go south. So the way that Task Force 38 was set up at the time was effectively in 3 strike groups, each of which had a couple of fleet carriers and a couple of fast battleships assigned to it, with the exception, ironically enough, of the first one, which was where New Jersey was. That just had the Intrepid, plus the 2 light carriers, the Independence class, Cabo and Intrepid. There were 3 other Independence class scattered throughout the formation as well. But, that's that. So if Halsey had decided he was going to detach the battleships at any point, he did have the option of detaching anything up to 5 other fast battleships before he needed to worry about himself. And so that's be South Dakota, Massachusetts, Iowa, Washington, and Alabama. And as regards tactical control of the carrier forces, Halsey is kind of semi-in charge on a tactical level. Obviously, he's going to be dictating, I want you to strike this, or this. But when it comes down to how that's executed, that is going to be largely up to the carrier commanders, the air group commanders, etc., etc. I mean, that's why Admiral Mitchell is aboard the Lexington to coordinate that. So, scouts will report Japanese forces, which Japanese forces are around, roughly where they are, and then Halsey's job would be to say, okay, well, I want the battleships to engage these, because remember, he actually sent Lee's battleships forward initially. They almost engaged Issei and Hyuga, and then he would say, okay, well, these other targets will be engaged by the carriers, but, Halsey's not at the level of this Avenger squadron from USS Essex will attack this particular ship. All of that is down to the much lower level of command. As for distance, ironically enough, as it turns out, when the first strike towards Ozawa's forces north was launched, they ended up actually travelling about the same distance, around about 250 miles, to find and hit Ozawa's forces as they would have had to do flying south to find and hit Kurita's forces. They're near enough equidistant. Of course, at that point, that's the first strike, and the US fast carriers are proceeding further north, so the distance between the US task force and Ozawa's fleet is decreasing, and the distance after that first strike between them and Kurita's forces is increasing. So in terms of diverting aircraft, even as they proceeded north, the fast carrier group was actually well within strike range of Kurita's forces at the time that reports began to come in. However, as far as Wolseley was concerned, it was a matter of A, priorities. He wanted to kill those Japanese carriers, and two, obviously, by the time the reports start to come in, and it's fairly clear that something's going horribly wrong with Taffy 3, then you have to factor in that a lot of the US strike aircraft are already off their carrier decks and heading north, at which point those aircraft can't really turn around and go all the way south because they'd have to double back, and obviously they've already burned fuel going north, and they're going to burn that same fuel coming back before they reach the equidistant point, and then they keep going south. So in theory, it would be possible with perhaps the aircraft the carriers had on deck as backup, but obviously their primary strike loads had already headed north. Now, as for how far the battleships from Admiral Lee's formation would have gone had Kurita pushed through Taffy 3 and gone after the transports, the interesting thing, again, is that the distances that both sides need to travel are roughly equal. At the time that Lee's battleships are finally detached south, they've got about 320 to 330 miles to go in a straight line to get to the eastern side of the San Bernardino Strait. Obviously, they've got considerably further to go to get to the landing areas, but if they get to San Bernardino Strait, they've cut off Kurita's line of escape. Kurita, at the time that he turns back at the Battle of Samar, for him to get all the way around to the main US landings area is about 150 miles or so, assuming he doesn't do something insane like run right up next to the coast to cut the corner a little bit, which of course means he's got about 320, 330 miles to go if he's going to go from the site of the Battle of Samar down to the landings and then back again to the entrance of San Bernardino Strait. And both formations actually have an approximately similar top speed. The Japanese are essentially limited by the top speed of Nagato and Yamato, so 26, 27 knots, and Lee's ships are limited by the speed of Washington, which is again about 27 knots. And assuming that both sides are actually pressing on at full power, which you could probably make a reasonable estimation that they're going to do that, you would then have a situation of Lee's ships arriving with a good amount of time to set up a blockade of the San Bernardino Strait and catch Kurita on the way back, or possibly head further south, depending on how good aerial recon is giving them information, to catch Kurita's forces as they sail back up. Because you've got, obviously, 7th Fleet, Admiral Kinkaid's older ships. They may well, in fact, almost certainly will, try to engage Kurita's forces, which will delay and slow them down somewhat, especially if battle damage is incurred, no matter who wins. And you've also got the fact that we're talking about distances, but we're talking also about time. Kurita's not just going to show up. If he's got to the transports and the landing area, he's not going to show up, go, that's nice, fire off a few salvos whilst he's on the turn and head straight back. He's going to have to spend some time shooting at targets. So even if Kinkaid's fleet, perhaps for speed reasons or whatever, either fails to engage or fails to pin down Kurita's forces, and so in terms of a distance and time calculation, they're a non-factor, if Kurita spends as little as 15 to 20 minutes shooting up the landing zone, that means that Lee is guaranteed to get back to San Bernardino Strait before Kurita does, and thus they would be able to stop Kurita on the way back. However, you're still talking about pretty much the full daylight hours remaining steaming for both sides, so there's no way that Lee is realistically going to get in behind and attack Kurita whilst Kurita is attacking the transports, unless for whatever reason Kurita slows down to 15-20 knots cruising speed and Admiral Kinkaid fights the most epic of all holding actions. Paul from Chicago asks, the Hawkins class and fire control, how were they managing to do it with so many single 7.5-inch guns? Could they hit the broadside of a barn? So exact specifications varied between ships in the class. There are two main sets of specification, but all of the ships had a Dreyer fire control computer, either a Mark 1 or a Mark 2, depending on the ship, and they all had a trio of rangefinders. The primary rangefinder was on the very, well, not on the very top, but atop the forward tripod mast, the foremast. just underneath the spotting position. And then there were 2 further rangefinders. Again, the exact size and dimensions of the rangefinders vary depending on the ship. The earlier ones had a bit of a range, the later ones had some more unified rangefinders. This particular vessel is Frobisher, just in case you're wondering. And if I've done my job correctly, then the view should gradually be zooming in to show you one of the secondary rangefinders positioned just behind the second funnel and just forward of the mainmast. Those rangefinders, of course, would supply data to the fire control computer. The fire control computer would supply the needed range and therefore elevation and bearing data, and that would be fed to each of the turrets, and then each of those 7.5-inch guns would have to be trained by the crew to point in the right direction, at which point it could all be centrally fired. Ibereg asks, would you recommend any books for learning about the service histories of USS Albacore and USS England? Yes, so for USS England, it's actually a pretty easy recommendation. There is a book called Anti-Submarine Warrior in the Pacific by John A. Williamson, and the reason that it's by John A. Williamson is that he happens to have been the ship's first executive officer and then actually commanding officer for the vast bulk of the time that she was at war in the Pacific in World War II, including, of course, that famous period where she sank a ton of Japanese submarines. So, that this is basically his story of what happened to England while he was aboard, and then obviously a little bit afterwards as well. Obviously, he covers briefly what happened to England once he left the ship, but that would be as a go-to book to start for England's career. That would be my first one. Now, as far as USS Albacore is concerned, you're going to have to drop me a message and let me know which Albacore you mean, because of course there's the Albacore of World War II, and there's the Albacore of the Cold War, the experimental nuclear submarine, which very, very technically, by the absolute skin of its teeth, falls under the Channel's time period of coverage because she was ordered less than 40 days before 1950 ran out. So by absolutely stretching the rules of the Channel time coverage, you could be talking about either the Gato class or the, solo Albacore. So let me know. Adani and Becky ask, given that it sometimes took many salvos to hit a target in real life, how many shots did it usually take to hit a test target during armor penetration testing? And was anything special done to improve accuracy during these tests, such as reducing the range or using special sighting equipment? Yes, a number of special measures were taken during armor penetration testing because, as you can imagine, even if you know the range for absolute certain, given the spread that you would encounter firing at even a full ship-sized target at normal battle ranges, trying to fire a single gun and hoping to hit a test plate, which is obviously significantly smaller than a full ship, is a bit of a fool's errand. So what they would do with armor penetration testing is they would actually bring the range much closer, to essentially suicidal might as well try boarding action range if it was real life, at which point, apart from anything else, you could probably bore sight straight down the barrel to ensure that you were hitting the target. And normally this range would be calculated to be just far enough that should something go extra dramatically, interestingly wrong, like, say, a shell embedding very slightly in the armor, then exploding and causing obviously huge amounts of shrapnel to blow back in the direction that it was fired upon, the people firing the gun would be safe. And sometimes if you were testing guns mounted in turrets, which obviously therefore had face armor and so forth, then you didn't even have to worry about that. You could get even closer. And the point of this was essentially to allow you to point the gun near enough as makes no difference, straight at the target, and guarantee, or near enough guarantee, that you're going to hit. Now, of course, that does raise a few problems, because all you would be simulating at that point is a point-blank hit test, which is fairly useless for working out whether or not the gun is going to work at a decent battle range. And so from that, what they would do is change some of the variables. So they would obviously have a ballistic table worked out that said, okay, well, at, say, 20,000 yards, the shell will be falling at this particular angle, and it will have this much remaining velocity. And then they'd go back to the other ballistic tables that they'd calculated for the gun, and then they would work out, okay, well, to get that velocity at essentially zero range, it might be a few hundred, maybe 1,000 yards or so, we need to reduce the charge by a given amount. And if they were being particularly careful about the testing, which a lot of the time they would be, they would also take the target and angle that target, because the line of flight of the shell is probably going to be near enough, as makes no difference, flat, i.e. perpendicular. So if, for example, you have an angle of fall of 18 degrees at 20,000 yards, and maybe you're firing at a slight distance, so maybe there'll be a 1 degree angle of fall, then you would just manually angle the plate the remaining 17 degrees, reduce your charge so that the velocity is correct for that range, and fire. And at that point, you are simulating a hit at 20,000 yards with the correct angle of impact and the correct speed of the shell, without actually having to fire the shell that far. Things could get a bit more complicated if the target was mounted on a ship, but by way of an example, the British 15-inch 42 caliber gun, which is obviously the Queen Elizabeth, Warspite, all of those kinds of ships, that had a muzzle velocity using World War I era shells of just over 2,460 feet per second at the muzzle. But if you look at the report, which if you want to look it up at Q is ADM 186-251, which is the report on the firing against Baden. They were using the German battleship Baden as a test target, and therefore obviously testing her armour efficacy. They actually used a ship, because Baden obviously was at sea, so you couldn't use a ground-mounted gun, because there weren't many 15-inch guns mounted within a few hundred yards of the shore, so they used the Monitor Terror, and they moored her 500 yards away from Baden, so you can guarantee pretty much everybody, when the firing was going on, was well under cover. They then heeled Baden over by 11 degrees, and they reduced the charge to just over 172 pounds of cordite, which resulted in a striking velocity. Obviously, there's a tiny fraction drop in shell velocity between the muzzle and 500 yards away, but the striking velocity was 1,550 yards, which they calculated corresponded to a drop and a velocity that would equate to an impact at just over 15,000 yards in real life. Brandon Minders asks, why did USS Worcester, or Worcester, I don't know how you in the US pronounce it. We pronounce it Worcester over here, so I'm calling it Worcester because that's how you spelled it. It's your fault otherwise. Anyway, CL-144, why did she go back to a twin turret? The US Navy seems to have been very good at building triple turrets, so why the reversion? Essentially, the short answer is weight. The triple turrets used in the Cleveland class, for instance, average at about 165 to 170 tons apiece, with a little bit of variation depending on the exact ship, exact class that's using the turret. But around about that, so let's say 170 tons. That's for a triple. Due to the introduction of the auto-loading, high elevation, all-angle loading, and multiple hoists that were needed for the automatic 6-inch that the Worcesters used, the weight of the twin turret went up to 200 tons. So you're already talking about 30 tons more, roughly, than a 666. So if you were to then expand that into an auto-loading 666, the weight is going to balloon still further. It's going to be absolutely massive. That has some issues with specific weight locations in a specific portion of the ship. You're going to need to significantly strengthen the deck of the ship in that area if you're going to go for a ultra massive, ultra heavy auto-loading 666 turret. But the other factor is that these are supposed to be dual-purpose turrets. They're supposed to track aircraft, and if you have your 250, 300 plus ton 666 auto-loader, that's going to need a huge amount more equipment in terms of machinery, etc., to get it moving and tracking fast enough to actually meaningfully engage aircraft, especially aircraft of the late World War II, immediate post-World War II era, which is what she was supposed to fight, because they're a bit quicker than most of the aircraft from the beginning of World War II. Whereas if you use the Twin, although it's still quite a heavy unit, you can get that tracking reasonably quickly and therefore get the engagement profile in, pretty well. That's why you have the same number of guns, 12 guns, as in both the Clevelands and in the Worcesters, but they're in twins in the Worcesters instead of triples in the Clevelands, which admittedly does mean that once you add up 6 200-ton turrets versus 4 170-ton turrets, the total weight of armament, if you include the turrets on the Worcesters, is almost double that of the Clevelands. The flip side is, of course, on the Worcesters, you don't need any 5-inch 38s because your main armament is also your secondary armament because it's fully dual purpose. And there's more weight generally to the Worcesters than there is to the average Cleveland by several thousand tons. And that's basically how you solve that problem. With the Des Moines class, whilst you could in theory use the 888s as an anti-aircraft gun, that wasn't a specifically called for design role. They were just worried about rate of fire. And again, the turret weights for those went up massively, but since they didn't have to worry quite so much about tracking, they stuck with essentially the same layout you have as the Baltimores. But when you look at a Des Moines versus a Baltimore, in actual fact, the vast majority of that weight increase is down to the turrets and the systems to cope with the turrets. Baron Van Dragon asks, in every painting, photo or film that I've seen, in a fully rigged ship, there never seems to be a mizzen course sail. Why? Is this simply a case of too much strain on the mast due to the spanker already being there? So a quick refresher for those of you who may not be quite so familiar with Age of Sail mast and sail naming conventions. The mizzen mast is the aftmost of a ship that has 3 masts. So you've got the foremast or forward mast, shortened to foremast. You have the main mast, rather self-explanatory. It's the biggest one and the one in the middle. And then you have the mizzen mast, which is the aftmost mast on a 3-masted sailing vessel. Back in, the prior to classic Age of Sail, Tudor period, that kind of thing, you would see some big ships with 4 masts, but as in literally 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, not 4 as in the 4-mast. Anyway, that aside, we're looking at the aftmast. And then a course sail, spelt C-O-U-R-S-E, not C-O-A-R-S-E, is the big square sail that is the lowest of them. So you can see in this picture of the USS Chesapeake, she has her forecourse and main course sails set, but as Baron Von Dragon points out, there is a rather obvious lack of a mizzen course sail. Now, there are 2 main reasons for why pretty much all classic Age of Sail ships do not have a mizzen course. Firstly, and you can actually see this here in the picture of Chesapeake painting, is that a lot of the time in the Age of Sail, the mizzen mast will be carrying a form of fore to aft sail on the lower part of the mizzen mast. In this case, as you can see here, it's streaming out backwards relative to the mast. In other cases, it would be a lateen sail in older ships, which would then be somewhat more forward than in this particular case. And depending on the size and layout, etc., this can go by a number of different names. So essentially the lower part of the mast is already occupied in terms of stress, strain, weight, distribution, force generated, etc., etc. The other reason is a little bit more mundane. Now, it's a little difficult to see in this particular painting because of all the sails being set, but you can still discern it if you look carefully. And if you go on most museum ships that preserve the half-mast, like, say, USS Constitution or HMS Victory, you'll also note this. If you look at the proportional distances, the space between the foremast and the mainmast is considerably larger than the space between the mainmast and the mizzenmast. And trust me, look through any half-decent painting or model of an Age of Sail ship-of-the-line frigate, you will find this. Now, what this means is that if you did have a mizzen course sail, and perhaps you don't have this fore and aft sail of whatever type, you're going to run into significant problems with wind shadow or stealing, i.e. if you have the wind coming from the aft or your port and starboard aft quarter, and you have a mizzen course, it's going to be close enough to your main course that it's actually going to absorb pretty much most of the wind that's coming from the aft portion of the ship, and thus your main course is going to be fairly ineffective. Now, considering that your main course is going to be one of, if not the largest sail on the ship, its rival being the sail you can see directly above the main course for that particular honour, that's a quite significant portion of your propulsion power which is going to be lost to the much smaller mizzen course, which therefore is going to generate considerably less power overall, thus make your ship actually considerably slower. This is one of the other reasons why a fore to aft mast, whether it be triangular or trapezoid, was very favoured there, because that allowed you to get energy out of the wind without obscuring your main course sail. It's not quite so much of an issue with the main course wind shadowing the forecourse because of that much greater distance between mainmast and foremast. And of course you could argue, well, why don't you put the mainmast further forward? Well, for one thing, you've got to take into account that all the forces created by these sails are acting at points of the ship. So if you start to move masts around, you're starting to move around where those forces are going to be interacting with the hull, which can completely throw off your ship's ability to sail properly. But secondly, if you equally spaced all three masts, you're going to end up with partial wind shadow all the way down the ship, at which point you've actually made the problem worse. ConeLed asks, obviously the circular run issues in World War II for torpedoes were real and dangerous since subs were lost to circular runs, but can you give some more details on the mechanics? How does the circular run happen, and when would a submarine know it was happening? And roughly how long would it take the torpedo to return to the point to where it was a threat to the submarine? How long a torpedo took to circle back round to hit its own launching vessel, whether that be a submarine or ship. In this case, you can see HMS Trinidad sinking. She wasn't finished off by a circular running torpedo. She was hit by German bombs, but she was badly damaged by a circular running torpedo shortly before she was bombed. Nonetheless, how fast it comes back round depends partially on what speed you've set the torpedo to, and also what rate of turn have you set it to, and potentially what rate of turn has it jammed at, because obviously if you've set it to lower speeds, let's say 30, 35 knots, to try and get it to go as far as possible, and it jams with, say, a 10 to 15 degree turn, that's going to take a lot longer to come back on you than, say, if you're an unlucky Japanese ship that's set a long lance to maximum like 50 plus knot speed with, say, a 45 degree turn upon launch. That thing's going to come back and hit you an awful lot quicker. Now, as far as when would you know it was happening, it depends what kind of visibility you've got. Now, of course, if you have hydrophones and sonar aboard, etc., you'll be able to hear that the torpedo is keeping going around on a bearing that you don't really think it should be. But if you can actually see the torpedo running, i.e. you've launched it, pretty much near the surface, obviously for ships or even for subs, if you've got direct line of sight on the wake, then you'll be able to see that it hasn't stopped turning when it should have done, or perhaps it has turned when it shouldn't have in the first place, much, much sooner than someone who's listening on the hydrophones will be able to go, hang on a minute, I don't think this is quite right. So, again, that answer is somewhat variable. As to how this happens, it can happen for basically two primary reasons. There are a few other, very rare occurrences as to why this might happen, but the two biggest ones are going to be, in second place, the rudder being jammed and altered by the launch. So bear in mind, you've got some launches are by compressed air, and on the surface some launches are by black powder. The rudder is, of course, designed to move, so it's not a fixed portion of the torpedo's assemblage. And of course, being at the back, it's going to be subjected to some of the strongest forces caused by that launching pressure. So it is possible that The launch will cause the rudder to shift against, of course, the mechanism that's trying to hold it straight. And then if that force is quite considerable, it might also jam the rudder in that position, either by the force that the rudder then actuates on its turning mechanism actually just breaking it, or potentially some distortion of the frame that makes it physically impossible for the rudder to realign itself. That's a possibility, but not the most common one, but it is known to have happened at times, and things like cold and ice can contribute to that. The most common, at least as far as I can tell statistically, is that you have the gyro, which is supposed to keep the torpedo moving in a straight line, and then you have a setting device whereby, essentially by clockwork timing, you can adjust this ring, which will then have the gyro aligned to a separate direction, let's say a 15-degree to port direction. And since the gyro is what dictates what the torpedo's rudder does, then when you launch the torpedo, the gyro will cause the rudder to turn the torpedo 15 degrees to port for a certain distance. And then once the timer runs out, the torpedo straightens up and it heads off in that direction. So that's how you get the torpedo to change course. And of course, the even more advanced ones, you launch the torpedo and then it turns a specific amount for a specific amount of time and then straightens up again. And then if you get really, 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 really advanced towards the later part of the war, you get some Axis torpedoes that actually do a slalom course through theoretical convoy. But in any case, so you have this mechanism that in some way, shape or form is capable of causing the torpedo to change its course. And if you set that, and again, you catapult the torpedo out via compressed air or black powder or whatever it is you're using, there is a possibility that you might cause some form of distortion, jamming or breakage in that system so that the torpedo rudder is set to a specific rate of turn, which you want. But when the time runs out and it's supposed to straighten up, that doesn't happen, again, because either some part is broken, so the command is never actually put in, or something is distorted, so it's now locked in place, and now the torpedo starts to run. Which means that, unfortunately, you can get a circular run using the first example, which is the less common of the two, but you can theoretically get a circular run from a torpedo that you programmed to run dead straight, but it's much more likely that you will get a circular run from a torpedo that you wanted to turn a small amount and then it didn't, which is one of several reasons why a number of submarine commanders preferred to try and point their submarine's bow pretty much as close to dead on was what the firing control solution said it should be as they could, because that eliminated the need to set the gyro to do anything other than keep the torpedo in a straight line. Chief Eyeroll asks, is the Naval Chronicle referred to in Six Frigates by Ian W. Toll the ancestor of or similar to the US Navy Institute's proceedings? Has historical research revealed who Albion, the commentator in the Naval Chronicle, actually was? It's similar. So for those of you who don't know, the Naval Chronicle was a, relatively speaking, short-lived but quite influential publication. The reason for its influence being that it ran pretty much at the height of the Napoleonic Wars from just before the end of the 18th century to 1819. Subsequent similar journals would eventually take its place, but that was the span of publishing for the Naval Chronicle. It was similar to Proceedings. So for those of you who, again, aren't aware of what that is, that's the US Navy Institute's sort of original publication, still ongoing, which is essentially an independent, if you like, textual talking shop, which can allow naval officers to discuss things concerning the current Navy regardless of rank. So, a lieutenant in the US Navy has just as much of a chance of getting an article published on the grand strategy that the US Navy should adopt for the 2020s as an admiral, and so on and so forth. So the Naval Chronicle is somewhat similar to that in that current issues were very definitely under discussion. But the Naval Chronicles remit was a little bit more wide-ranging. So the US Navy Institute also publishes nowadays Naval History magazine, which, as the name suggests, covers historical topics. Naval Chronicle did publish some of that as well, biographies of admirals who had recently been in the Navy, reviews of battles that had happened a few years to a few decades ago. And in a kind of halfway house between the two, although probably more proceeding style than Naval History magazine style, the Naval Chronicle also covered recent events, which obviously in the Napoleonic Wars there were quite a lot of recent events in terms of battles, especially smaller scale actions and so on and so forth. And it could draw together a lot of different accounts. So, for example, in the Naval Chronicle, you can find both the Royal Navy and French accounts of some battles like the Nile. And the reason why you see in a lot of fictional settings set in that period, like the Patrick O'Brian novels or the Hornblower novels, officers like, I really hope my action's going to get in the Naval Chronicle, because, that meant it was significant and interesting enough for people to be discussing it and promoting it as hopefully a way to do things, and hopefully not an example of how not to do things. So it's not the direct ancestor of US Navy Institute proceedings, because there's about a half-century gap between Naval Chronicle finishing and proceedings starting, and of course they are for two separate services, but it could be seen in some ways as a spiritual ancestor, one of several. As far as who Albion was, I'm not aware that anyone has pinned down and said this is exactly who they were. I could be, not mistaken, because I'm just saying I don't know, but I could be mistaken in thinking that that author hasn't been identified, but I personally suspect it was probably a general name for a variety of commentators, because of course we know the Naval Chronicle was run by several different men all working together. So I rather suspect that rather than anyone putting their specific name to a specific comment, they all would generally be able to write under the pseudonym, and maybe even independent contributors could as well. Peter Guy asks, in a recent social media post regarding the town of Westport, Massachusetts, a coastal community on Buzzards Bay in the southeastern part of Massachusetts, someone posted a picture of a 4-story rectangular tower located on one of the town beaches with a telltale horizontal slit on the 4th floor of the tower. As I was erroneously taught as a child, many speculated that this was a lookout post to spot U-boats. Others correctly pointed out that this wasn't an observation tower for submarines, but one person in particular correctly noted that this was the fire control tower for the 2 12-inch guns in a coastal battery at the southern tip of New Bedford, which is consistent with my understanding of the regional harbour defences. However, at the end of the comment, this person stated that the anti-submarine defences actually consisted of an underwater hydrophonic listening station, or stations. I found that hard to believe, given that the reason this harbour was so well defended was because it was full of commercial shipping traffic and thus full of hydrophonic noise. Nevertheless, because this person was otherwise so spot on about the nature of the harbour defences, I figured I'd ask you if you knew of any coastal defences that employed such underwater listening stations in World War II or otherwise. The gentleman or lady or whoever it was who was making that comment is, very well informed, actually. Believe it or not, Massachusetts was kind of the home and prototype centre of the US Navy's offshore submarine detection and defence network, with underwater hydrophone stations actually being tested off the US coast, not necessarily outside of Westport, but in the general vicinity off the Massachusetts coast, back in the First World War. In the Second World War, there was actually quite a comprehensive system of detection devices, I suppose you could call them, which were stationed off of some elements of the US coast, and quite a number of Massachusetts ports had these. So I don't know specifically about Westport and Buzzards Bay, but I suspect, given that you've got this somewhat worse for wear looking fire control station, it's entirely possible that this bay might well have had them as well. And this took the form of basically 3 systems that were all integrated together. So you had floating buoys, which today we'd call sonar buoys or something like that, which when they detected something nearby, they could obviously radio signals back. You then had underwater hydrophones fixed to the seabed, and obviously that would all come back via cabling. So the listening station itself, well, it depends how you define the listening station. If you define the listening station as the hydrophone, then yes, it's underwater. If you define the listening station as the place where people are sitting and listening to the signals, no, it wouldn't be underwater. But that would be back on shore, but listening to the signals transmitted. And these were actually quite far offshore. We're not talking about, like 500,000 yards off of the beach. We're talking several miles or more out into the ocean. And then the last system was lots and lots of what was called indicator loop cable. So this is essentially the predecessor to the systems that you won't see because they're under the ground, but the systems that are laid in advance of traffic lights in a lot of places, including quite a few areas across the UK, I suspect in other places as well, which are used to detect vehicles, and then that dictates when the traffic lights will switch if they've got an advanced enough controller to be on a variable timer. And it's essentially the same thing, magnetic loop induction. Boston Harbour had a huge amount of this protecting it. And the idea was that between all of these plus the shore-based installations, you could try and detect and deal with submarines, because there were also remote activated minefields that you could use as well. The idea being that if a submarine, or anything obviously with a ferrous magnetic hull, passed over the indicator loops, then you'd get a signal. So this cable has been tripped at approximately this location. And then you could either by radio, by visual spotting, by searchlight, by schedule, work out, are there any surface ships crossing in this area? And if not, then, well, that means a submarine has triggered it. At which point you can start listening using the sonar buoys and the hydrophones. And obviously one isn't going to do you any good, but if you've got 2, 3, 4, 5, you can start to triangulate the propeller sounds and work out the approximate location of the submarines, or submarine hopefully. And then if you know where that submarine is, then hopefully you'll know which part of the defensive minefield it's likely to pass through, and you can remotely activate that section of the minefield and hope that it runs into a mine, or possibly call up some kind of aerial support to go and bomb, depth charge, or strafe the sub if it happens to be on or near the surface. Exactly how successful these were is a little bit difficult to tell, partly because it's a relatively unknown portion of the Battle of the Atlantic, so, that's why I said the commentator was pretty well informed in the first place, but also because segments of those stations' activities, at least the last time I looked through for NARA records of them, some segments are still officially restricted or classified. Now you might wonder, that's a bit stupid, because it's 80 plus years since these things were installed. However, that to me indicates one of two things, well, possibly one of three things, to be honest. The third option is some rather dim person has gone through, but dim but with authority, has gone through and gone, this sounds sensitive, we shall reclassify it, the same way that a bunch of immediate post-war nuclear mentioning documents were classified because some idiot decided that anything with the word nuclear in it was therefore a state secret. Things like plans for the conversion of the battleship Kentucky into a nuclear missile carrier, even though pretty much the only nuclear thing they reveal is the fact that they were planning on putting early generation nuclear missiles on those plans, doesn't actually tell you anything about, building nuclear weapons or anything like a modern nuclear weapon, but it had the word nuclear in it, therefore it had to be reclassified. I don't know if they've been declassified at some point. They may still be classified, but anyway. So yeah, it may be someone has done that. But more likely, to my mind at least, is either that the nature and location of some of these defenses is still relevant in some manner. Perhaps, the systems are there roughly in the same places, but they've just been upgraded to modern standards. So obviously, if you had copies of the original plans, you could tell roughly where the new equipment is, and for obvious reasons, they wouldn't want anyone knowing about that. The other reason, which would be potentially related to it, is maybe those defenses aren't there anymore, and maybe the new defenses are somewhere else, but maybe someone somewhere in the chain of command has decided that there's enough information in those plans to give some indication of either how modern systems are used, or perhaps some pointers as to, these being precursors that might give people guidance on developing their own systems, and therefore that's why it's been still classified. And it may be that, that could have been a valid concern 40, 50 years ago, and they've just put it on some kind of long-term classification that either won't expire for a little while, or maybe needs to be requested to be declassified, or something like that. Because I can see that being a fairly valid concern in, say, the late 50s, early 60s, especially given, obviously, in the Cold War you had the whole SOSUS net, which isn't a million miles divorced from these harbour defences in terms of general operational concept. Bob asks, what was the mechanical accuracy of good battleship guns, i.e. ignoring all external environmental and aiming factors and assuming they had top-shelf ammo? What sized circle would shells land in at, let's say, medium range? Now, in terms of empirical evidence, that's quite a difficult one, because, of course, if you fire a gun even under near-perfect test conditions, any kind of long-distance naval gun being shot is always going to be subject to some kind of environmental factor. Even if you've locked it into the exact location in terms of elevation and training, and that's absolutely locked in on land, no roll, pitch, etc., etc., you've got the absolute top quality ammunition within your quality assurance tolerances, etc., nice calm day, nice even temperature, there's still pretty much certainly going to be some change in wind direction given the total altitude and distance that the shell is going to attain, and there's definitely going to be temperature differences, which is all going to obviously affect how accurate the shell is. And then, of course, you've got humidity and other factors. So from a strictly empirical perspective of this was a near perfect test condition and it got accuracy of X, there's still stuff going to be affecting it. But if you go spherical cow in a vacuum scenario where you've got shells that are performing exactly to spec, they're within the quality assurance limits, and we've got a completely neutral atmosphere, a completely ideal temperature, and all those other things, then at that point, the two largest influencing factors for a good quality battleship gun will be the very slight tolerances within good quality control, propellant, and shells, and the even tinier tolerances involved in the windage of the gun itself. Now, factoring in those as simple percentage factors, i.e. what is the quality control limit for windage and what is the quality control limit for shells and propellant, and then taking half of each of those, i.e. so we're talking about the median case for a good quality gun, that would suggest that you're looking at something in the order of, depending on exactly which gun you're using and depending on exactly which range you're using, somewhere between 15 and 22,000 yards, you'd be looking at a circle approximately 50 to 80 yards across, so a radius of 25 to 40 yards, which is obviously insanely precise. That's kind of hit the same medium-sized bunker at over a dozen miles repeatedly with every single shot precise. HMS Etc. asks, how would you design the ultimate US fleet oiler for the Pacific in the run-up to World War II, assuming you have some degree of foresight and full financial and political support? How many would you want to lay down, and what would be the ideal target cruising speed? Would you want to incorporate a modest armour belt, subdivided machinery spaces, and torpedo protection? Or what about an armoured deck, 5-inch 38s, Bofors, etc.? Okay, so if I have a degree of foreknowledge and I'm building essentially a fast fleet oiler, you might be surprised by some choices, especially considering how some US fleet oilers turned out historically. So we can look at this again in your standard triangle: speed, protection, and firepower. Speed, I'm actually going to look at a maximum speed of 25 knots. That sounds very extravagant for a naval auxiliary, and it probably is, but you said design the ultimate fleet oiler, and within reason this would be my ultimate fleet oiler. Part of the reason I would be designing it for a target speed of 25 knots as its maximum is that it means I can then cruise in the high teens or maybe even low 20s at a much more economical fuel usage rate. That in turn means that pre-war I can sell it as this fleet oiler can keep up relatively comfortably with the battle fleet regardless of whatever speed the battle fleet's going at, and it means that come the actual war, and you have fleet travelling at higher speed with cruisers and fast battleships and aircraft carriers, whilst a 25-knot ship isn't going to keep up with, a carrier unit or something that's travelling at well over 30 knots for battle, I will be able to keep up with the same task group while it's cruising at more normal speeds, which obviously for them, again, may well be in the high teens or low 20s if they're in a kind of rapid transit. And if they're, doing a long distance, relatively high speed transit at 25 knots, again, I can probably still roughly keep level with them. I would probably do this by actually, believe it or not, taking a page out of German World War I battleship design concepts. I would have a 3-screw vessel. Most of the issues with triple screw propulsion aren't really present on an auxiliary like a tanker, and I'd have the center screw being my cruising screw, and that would be powered by some diesel engines taken from the submarine production lines, whilst my 2 outboard shafts would be high-speed geared turbines for when I need to move at speed. It also gives me a useful reserve of power, which means I can cruise at, high teens, low 20s of knots, even in really bad weather. Now, in terms of protection, I would give it subdivided machinery spaces, but I'd probably have to do that anyway, because obviously if I'm going to have 2 outer shafts running steam turbines and then a diesel in the middle, they're probably going to need to be divided off, whatever. To be honest, I don't think it's going to do a huge amount because, look at the Cimarron class and pretty much all fleet oilers, all the machinery is compacted right at the back there. So whilst having divided up machinery spaces might help a little bit in some circumstances, and I would do it, I don't think it's going to be massively improving the ship's survival chances. In terms of other protection, I don't think there's any real point in torpedo protection, armor belts and armor decks of any substantial degree, simply because if the ship comes under sustained attack from a significant enemy, you have to reach a kind of a minimum threshold for that kind of protection to be worth anything. So you'd need 3 to 4 inches of deck armor to resist, well, in this case, Japanese bombs. You'd need at least 3 to 4 inches of belt armor to resist shells. That's going to be a colossal amount of weight to stick on a fleet oiler, which is going to either make it massively bigger and more expensive for the same amount of carrying capacity or massively cut into your carrying capacity. Either way, it's a huge amount of sacrifice for not a lot of utility, because the chances that your fleet oiler is going to come under that kind of sustained attack relative to how much oil are you not delivering, the trade-off's not worth it. With that said, I would have a deck that's 1 inch thick STS, i.e. splinter proofing, and I would have the sides along the machinery and along the oil tank spaces. Those I would give 1 inch STS plating, similar to how the Fletchers did down their sides, because as I say, that splinter proofing, it will resist gunfire, cannon fire, near misses, and shrapnel therefrom, etc. So that kind of protection is certainly worth doing. But I think that's about as far as I would go. And then finally, the firepower element. The Cimarron class actually had a relatively substantial 5-inch 38 armament during World War II, once the war really got going. Personally, though, I'm not actually going to go with that. Now, that might shock a few of you because it's the 5-inch 38. Why wouldn't you have it? But again, my perspective is if you end up in a situation where you're having to defend your fleet oiler with guns, you've already failed, and it's probably not going to help much at all. 4 5-inch 38s on a ship that doesn't have significant radar, rangefinder, fire control installations, etc. What are you going to fight off with that in the surface action? A destroyer will massively outgun you simply because it's got a fully operational fire control suite. And you need all the fire control suites you can get on your combat ships. And then air-wise, until you get VT fusing, which is much later in the war, wasting a lot of weight on a few scattered 5-inch 38s, again without massively precise fire control, is a bit of a hiding to nothing. Now, what I would stick on instead would be maybe half a dozen 3-inch 50s, because the other thing you've got to bear in mind is, of course, every gun you install, that means more crew, more weight for ammunition, and so on and so forth. So I would stick in, as I said, maybe half a dozen 3-inch 50s, maybe a couple on the bow, one either side of the funnel on the stern, one either side of the bridge, because they're just as good at the occasional bit of anti-submarine work, and you've got their more rapid firing than a 5-inch 38, and they require less crew per gun, so you can get lots of shells into the air, and with the limited fire control that you have, that's probably a better bet. And you could maybe pair them up, in positional terms at least, with maybe 4 to 6, bearing in mind it's pre-war, quad 1.1s, because then you can replace those with Oerlikons or Bofors as and when they come online. So essentially you're looking at a pure anti-air defense with a little bit of anti-submarine - close-in anti-radar, anti-surface capacity, but you really don't need to worry about that too much. That, I think, would be my ultimate balanced fleet oiler. So it's obviously going to be a fairly big ship anyway to get up to that 25 knot top speed, but I think it should be able to take care of itself without sacrificing too much carrying capacity for relatively unnecessary defences. PH5817 asks, how were coal ashes disposed of on World War I capital ships? Was there some mechanised system to get rid of them? And can you give us an idea of mass disposed of for a day? You'll just have to put up with silent me narrating USS Olympia's ash chute, at least the top half of it, because this is how it was done. So depending on the capital ship, especially how old it is, will depend on the method. So Olympia obviously is a slightly older vessel, but her method of transferring is still present in a number of World War I era ships, and that is simply ash goes in a bucket, which is then attached to a chain, which is then brought up to the weather deck by means of machinery, as you can see here. That then comes out of a hatch and can be disposed of over the side by hand. There were some automatic systems, most of which would rely on, once the ash gets up to this point, it would then automatically be dumped into a storage area rather than have to be transferred off the ship by hand, and then periodically using some high pressure water from the ship's fire main system, that a storage area for the ash would be opened up to the outside world, and then everything would just be blasted out by high pressure water. And then there's in the mid 1900s, there's all sorts of adverts about different systems saying, we can store much more ash than our competitors. Other systems saying you will use less water to blast out the ash than our competitors, and so on and so forth. And then in terms of how you are getting the ash up there are 1 or 2 systems towards the end of the 1900s that advertise themselves as not fully automatic, because otherwise they'd have to be actually inside the boilers themselves, but at least partially automatic, i.e. rather than having to, you still have to manually fill an ash bucket with the relevant ash in question, but once you stick it in there, it could be simply a case of hitting a button and up and off it goes to either be received or to go into storage, as opposed to someone having to stand there and manually cycle the system every time a bucket needs to come up. Mass it's impossible to determine. A battle cruiser at full speed all day, dreadnought in harbour all day, different amount. Library of Context asks, in the short period during the introduction of ironclads when gun technology fell behind armour, ramming came back into vogue. When were the first and last ram-equipped ships commissioned by a major navy, and who were they? In terms of the first capital vessel, equipped with a ram, I would probably have to go with CSS Virginia, because Warrior and Gloire certainly didn't have ram bows. Some enterprising Confederate officer, however, did stick one on Virginia, even if it ended up getting stuck in the Cumberland. So, that's pretty early. You're going to struggle to find an ironclad earlier than Virginia with a ram bow. As far as the last, that is a little bit more difficult. One of the contenders, although not the winner, believe it or not, it's actually the Lord Nelson class. Some pre-dreadnoughts or semi-dreadnoughts had actually already done away with ram bows. The Lord Nelson class pre-dreadnoughts or semi-dreadnoughts did have a ram bow, that last ram bow fitted to a British capital ship, and thanks to the delays that they incurred because some of their stuff was stolen to help complete Dreadnought, they ended up the latest commission was at the very end of 1908, so they were one of the last ships to enter service with a ram bow. However, I suspect, at least in terms of capital ships for largish navies, I think the Tegethoff class of the Austro-Hungarian Navy are probably either the very latest or, in the top three, because they're full-on dreadnoughts and they have very prominent ram bows, and they are in service, 1912 onwards. So I think they're a very strong contender, if not the actual winners. Randy Topeka asks, it's well known that USS Nevada was able to get underway relatively quickly during the attack on Pearl Harbor. But how much of a feat was this for her crew, considering that she had no tug or pilot assistance, was being commanded by an ensign, was on fire and flooding, and had many of her crew ashore? How big a display of seamanship was it that they were able to manoeuvre her away from the pier and get underway at all during the battle? Is it as impressive as it sounds, or was a departure without tugs and pilots something that was somewhat trained for? It's a little bit weird in that Nevada getting underway both is and isn't impressive. It just depends on what angle you're coming at it from. If you're coming at it from a purely mechanical perspective, well, she had two boilers lit unlike everybody else, so she was able to raise enough steam pressure to get at least minimally underway. And because she was moored on her own at the northern end of Battleship Row, she had the clearance to do so. So, for example, even if Arizona had wanted to get underway, she had Vestal outboard of her, so she wasn't going anywhere fast. And in terms of tugs and pilots, well, pilots needed to, maneuver through a specific area in a harbour, channels and so forth that they know best. But the area down that side, the east side of Ford Island, would have been relatively well known to the general crew. So, being able to maneuver down a bit that you've seen lots of other ships maneuver down, not really hugely difficult. Low speed maneuvering, however, that's why you usually have tugs, because you need above a certain speed to get steerage way on a battleship for the rudder to be effective. If you maneuver at very low speeds with any kind of large ship that just uses a propeller and rudder setup, it can be very difficult to get the ship to go where you want it to go. So there are obviously ways to get around that, and one of those ways is just to ramp up the speed a little bit, which obviously shortens your reaction time and widens your turning circle in confined waters like a harbour, but it does give you the ability to manoeuvre in and of itself, and the ability to emergency scramble yourself from standing effectively and get underway would have been something that battleship crews were taught, because, hey, if a sudden war breaks out, you might need to do that, shockingly. So from that side of things, it's not necessarily surprising that the crew were able to do that per se. All the features necessary for that to occur were in place. The flip side, of course, is that, yes, she had been hit by a torpedo. The senior-most officer available was an ensign. They were under an unexpected attack. The crew, therefore were short-staffed, completely out of the blue situation, also having to conduct damage control against the flooding from the torpedo hit. And then once they get underway and they start getting bombed, they've also got to put up with, being actively on fire, plus still trying to shoot down Japanese aircraft. And in the middle of all that, trying to keep control of your ship, which still has relatively minimal power, maneuvering down a fairly narrow, confined harbour space, whilst everybody else around you, as well as you, is under attack. That is hugely impressive. So I would say to be at least somewhat accurate, you would have to divide it up into two sections. As I said, the mechanical side, not really a surprise they were able to do so. But the circumstantial and human side of things, it's a colossal feat of seamanship, especially given the fact that, by the time she completes her short voyage, she's sinking, has torpedo damage, leaking through bulkheads, fire damage, including gasoline fires, Japanese planes attacking her, plus the stress of, not wanting to cause a major problem for the Navy, plus a short-staffed crew, plus at that point, the ensign in command is also minus a leg and will eventually have to be forcibly removed from the bridge by his crew. And they still manage to run the ship aground in a place where she's not a particularly major obstacle to incoming and outgoing shipping and can be, relatively speaking, easily salvaged. That is probably the single most impressive portion of her entire voyage. Richard Shu asks, in the movie Godzilla -1, we see, among other things, Takao help fight Godzilla. But there's also a minesweeping scene where two Japanese wooden minesweepers clear up American mines. In the movie, these two minesweepers drag a rope with a blade between them to unhook mines from the harness holding them underwater. They then destroy the mines with a 13mm machine gun from the surface when the mine pops up. Is this an accurate depiction of mine hunting, at least for post-war Japan? Well, for immediate post-World War II Japan minesweeping operations, it's actually pretty much spot on. You've probably heard me say on the Dry Dock before, not just for a sci-fi fantasy movie, for a movie generally, where Godzilla -1 shows naval scenes, it's actually one of the highest fidelity, most accurate movies that's been out for a long time. And that's saying something, considering it's a Godzilla movie. So at some point I will have to go over all of that. But more specifically, coming back to the Minesweeper, there weren't a huge number of Imperial Japanese Navy ships left over generally, and in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the US was not particularly keen on letting Japan have any back or fully operational to any significant degree. So a couple of old wooden boats, stringing a line between them with chain cable rope cutters, and then you attack the mine when it pops to the surface. That's pretty much spot on. I mean, you're essentially doing paravanes, except without the paravane bit. So obviously with paravanes, you'd have the ship in the middle and you'd be streaming paravanes to either side. These ships are not large enough, powerful enough, or military style to really stream any meaningful paravane, so they are acting essentially as the paravane either side, with the weighted rope or chain or cable, etc., between them. And it could be, a thick, strong rope with chain breakers or cutters or whatever. It could be a steel cable or a chain, which would be a bit better, but obviously heavier. About the only real thing that they don't show it because they don't need to, but if you were looking at it from a completely holistic point of view, would be that a lot of these things would have multiple cutters, because you can't necessarily guarantee that the mine is going to be snagged in such a way that it can drag down all the way to the middle. So you might have 2 or 3 cutters present along whatever it is you've strung between the boats, and then once it's detached from its anchor, mine pops to the surface, shoot at it with whatever ordnance you happen to have. In this case, it's a machine gun. That's basically what life was like in the immediate post-World War II Japan, if you wanted to get rid of the mines. Little Dweller asks, during World War II, the Royal Navy's steam gunboats were originally called SGB-3 through SGB-9, but were later renamed Grey Seal, Grey Fox, etc., as they met the criteria for having proper ship names. What were these criteria, and did other navies have similar rules, or was it a little bit more ad hoc? Unfortunately, it's one of those things that varies hugely with navy, and also to a certain extent varies quite considerably with time. Because, well, to take an example, the Imperial German Navy and most of the time the Kriegsmarine tended to name their destroyers, well, not naming them, essentially. They wouldn't but just give them hull numbers. So if you look at German torpedo boats dash large destroyers, or large torpedo boats dash destroyers in World War One, you'll see it's S69, V73, and so on and so forth. And then the Kriegsmarine, initially they name their destroyers, but they go back to using Z, insert number here, relatively quickly as well. Whereas if you look at the Royal Navy, they do have, at the very earliest stage, some torpedo boats do have numbers like TB3 or whatever, but very quickly, even what would be classified as proper torpedo boats rather than torpedo boat destroyers start to acquire names, and World War I and World War II Royal Navy destroyers are all named, as are smaller ships like frigates and corvettes. And some of the larger fast attack craft, you really have to get down to small coastal motorboats, motor gunboats, etc., and in this case the steam gunboats, before you start to see them just having numbers. Then you have the US Navy, where ships are, no matter their size, relatively often referred to as much by their hull numbers or other hull numerical designations as they are by their names. So you see people referring to the World War II Enterprise and CV6 relatively interchangeably. Same thing with destroyers or battleships, etc. One of the suggested rules has been that if a navy considers something a boat, it will receive a numerical designation or an alphanumerical designation, whereas if it considers it a ship, then it will get a name. Now, as an overall rule of thumb, this is workable, but there are some fairly glaring exceptions and some examples of extreme pedantry. So, for example, as we said with the German destroyers, pretty much, especially by World War II, pretty much everybody agrees that a destroyer is a ship, and the Germans actually have some of the larger destroyers going into World War II, but they still insist on naming a good chunk of them with alphanumeric designations, basically because someone, presumably in the Imperial German Navy, decided they were boats. And then, of course, you have submarines, which most people still agree are technically boats, but the US, for example, started off naming its submarines with alphanumeric designations and then switched to actual names. So did the British. Look in World War I, and the American boats are S something. The British boats are usually, their class designation, so A, B, C, D, E, followed by a number. But come World War II, the 1930s, 1940s boats in both the US and British navies now all have names, whereas the Germans stick with just U, insert number here. The Japanese, for the most part, also are, I, insert number here. So, unfortunately, there's no real consistency. Mike Lima 777 asks, what, in your opinion, is the most interesting equipment or room on a ship that seems to be tied to their nation's culture? Americans and their ice cream machines, Italy and France having wine cellars, the Japanese having onsen baths on capital ships, etc. I think purely from a fascination point of view, it would have to be the wine stores. As you can see here, that's the lower section of this cross-section area of the Danton class battleships, where it looks like all the barrels are. Yeah, that literally is the case. Because, the Japanese ships having baths is interesting, but, high enough up in the superstructure, sure, you can find a spare compartment for that kind of thing if you want. The US, an ice cream machine, again, it stands in a room that is already dedicated to making food. The food supplies that it consumes, it's just general food supply that's stored in general food supply lockers. Everything could be interchangeable. But when it comes to the wine cellars, deep down in the ship, occupying what's essentially cargo hold space in a dedicated area, you've got to be really, really dedicated to that particular item of your diet in order to convert an entire area of your ship to specialist cargo containing zones for that food or drink. Christopher Dooley asks, as you've mentioned in previous videos, the HMS Essex that was lost at Quiberon Bay was something like 80 years old when she went down. Given the repairs, overhauls, refits, etc. that a wooden ship would go through during that time, how much of the original ship would remain after 80 years of service? In the period that the channel covers, how close does any ship come to being a ship of Theseus? Is this the sort of thing that navies would even bother tracking? Unfortunately, it's another one of those it depends very much on the ship and time period questions. A wooden warship generally that's been in service for 80 years could be at its core substantially original if it hadn't seen much action and had spent most of its time in ordinary, maybe being brought out into service for the occasional war. The masts would definitely have been replaced. The outer planking would definitely have been replaced. Maybe some parts of the outer decking, but a lot of the inner decking, the frames, the beams, etc., the general structure that makes the ship what it is, may very well be original at that point. Conversely, a ship that's seen a lot of active service and has maybe seen a number of battles will have substantially less original material in it by the time it finishes its career, and everything in between. So with Essex in particular, it's very difficult to tell, because not only would navies not generally tend to track that kind of thing as a matter of course. So, if Essex hadn't been lost at Quiberon Bay, if she'd been retired a few years later, the Navy wouldn't have looked back on her while they were breaking her up and gone, aha, well, this bit of wood is from the ship as she was originally built, and this bit of wood is from her refit in this year, and this bit of wood is from her refit in this year. At best, they might have had the records from the last time she went through a major refit and gone, oh yeah, these are the bits that were added last time, so they're probably the best ones to salvage for future ships, and that probably would have been about it. Now, the particular thing with HMS Essex is that in the early part of the 1700s, the Royal Navy went through a period much like the US Navy did in the latter part of the 19th century, when the government simply just wouldn't give them any money for building new ships. And so the Royal Navy engaged in pretty much the same thing that the US Navy did, the creative rebuild process. So Essex was rebuilt at least twice, possibly more. And what constitutes a rebuild in the Age of Sail can be quite a number of things. Sort of the bare minimum for a rebuild would be strip off the mast, strip off the planks, strip off a good chunk of the decking, and essentially take the ship down to keel and frames, with maybe some internal decking and structure in place, and redo everything that you've just taken off. So, an extreme slim down. At that point, you could argue that the core of the ship is still the ship, but you could also have a rebuild which was, we've physically taken the ship apart like a giant reverse IKEA kit, and maybe we'll use some of the timbers that are left. And sometimes that was used to expand the size of a ship. So you take it completely apart, and then you might go, okay, well, let's say our ship has a 130 foot long keel, but you want a ship that's 150 foot long because you want to add a few more guns to it. So obviously you're going to need either a new keel or a keel extension, probably a new keel at that point, because extended keels with joints in them are weak spots. And then you would obviously go, right, well, all of these frames can go up to here, and all of these frames can come from the back here, and that leaves a gap. So we take the dimensions of the frames either side of the gap, and then we're going to have to incorporate new frames in. And if you think that's not going to work, you might have to replace more frames than that, and obviously battle damage might require patched or replacement frames as well. So how much of the Essex that was lost at Quiberon Bay was the same as the Essex that was launched, at that point a couple of generations earlier? Who knows? And you get the same issue with HMS Victory. How much of the wood on HMS Victory was actually present at the Battle of Trafalgar? Estimates vary, but some of them are quite low. And therefore, you do end up with a kind of Ship of Theseus problem. But then the thing is, and I've explained this to a few people when I've been to Portsmouth, Dockyard and other places, I personally think that if you're approaching the Ship of Theseus problem, you have to look at what kind of ship is it and how was it envisaged to be used, because a big wooden warship in the Age of Sail was built with the expectation that at the very least the masts and the exterior planking would essentially be recyclable, reusable items. So yeah, no one claims that a steel warship today is a Ship of Theseus because it's been stripped down and repainted a few times, because it's acknowledged that the paint is a consumable item. Whereas, if you have to replace the keel and a substantial part of the frames, i.e. the ship's core structure, then you can start entering into, well, is this technically really the same ship as the one that was originally built? And if so, and I think you can make a certain argument, if the ship breaks its keel, you take the ship apart, put a new keel in, put the original frames and decking back in place, you can make a very good argument that's still the original ship. But then if later on the ship is engaged in a very heavy battle and limps home and you suddenly end up having to replace most of the framework, is it still the original ship? Where is the continuity? The fact that it's a ship that contains some original timbers that's in continuous service with the Navy? Is there a certain minimum percentage of the ship that everything has to fall into? And this is why it's a bit different with steel ships, because obviously with steel ships, replacing the armor and maybe some of the hull plating is seen as interchangeable, consumable, but a lot less of a modern steel warship or an early 20th century steel warship would be seen as interchangeable as compared to the proportion of a wooden warship that would fall into that category. But as I said, by and large, I don't think navies keep real track of this kind of thing, because while the ship's in active service, they're mostly thinking of it just in terms of active service utility. And it really only becomes a matter of interest once the ship leaves service and is perhaps now a museum vessel of some description. Nick Brodar asks, I've read Vincent O'Hara's Struggle for the Middle Sea and Six Victories. Can you recommend any more reading on the World War II Mediterranean Naval War or the Regia Marina? Yes, I definitely can. There are a couple more that actually Vince O'Hara has written. There's In Passage Perilous, Malta and the Convoy Battles of June 1942. Obviously, that's a rather specific look, but it's definitely a major part of it. And then there's Dark Navy, the Italian Regia Marina and the Armistice of 8th of September 1943, both of which definitely worth a read. If you want to look at the Malta convoys more widely, there's a book just literally called The Malta Convoys. You'll recognize it when you see it in a bookshop or on online. It's, phone book thickness. Then there's, and I'm really sorry, Italian Naval Archives, you'll kill me for mispronouncing this, but there's Bagnasco's books, so Littorio class Italian battleship, which covers the Cavours and Dorias, Italian heavy cruisers and Italian assault craft. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but he did a huge amount of work on the Italian Navy in Italian, and those are the 4 books he's done specifically on Italian ships that have been translated into English. He also did one on submarines generally, which has been translated into English, which obviously will contain Italian submarines. And each of those is quite good, because not only does it cover the developmental history, but also gives you quite a lot of the background of the Regia Marina, why the ships were built or rebuilt, etc. And also tells you quite a lot about their operational history, which obviously is going to involve a lot of the Second World War. Obviously, Admiral Cunningham's autobiography will cover a huge amount of the Mediterranean conflict from his perspective. A good overall summary book, which covers almost everything you'd want to know and gives you good references to chase down specifics, would be Mussolini's Navy, a reference guide to the Regia Marina of 1930 to 45 by Maurizio Brescia. I think that's how you pronounce it. Anyway, that's a really good overall look at things. And if you want an even shorter version that's, as I say, very pricey considering the range of subject matter it covers, there's Italian Battle Fleet 1940 to 1943 by Enrico Senucci. Now that, at the time this goes up, is not actually out yet. It's being released by Osprey Publishing with a theoretical print date of the end of April. And more generally, you've got Bernard Islands War in the Mediterranean 1940 to 1943, which is a good overview for both sides. Reichsbeer Minister asks, perhaps this is its own Wednesday video, but could you talk about the development of propulsion shafts on ships in the steam and steel era? I do understand that there are very large forces at work, but how did the engineering department manage to not end up with a heap of scrap metal wandering around inside the ship? Fortunately for shipping, but unfortunately for extensive discussion, the nature of propeller shafts actually pretty much settles itself very quickly in the era of steam, to the point that during the iron and steel era, there's not really a vast amount of change that occurs. You know, that someone looking at the propeller shaft arrangement of a World War II vessel could look at the propeller shaft arrangement of an 1860s ironclad and be broadly familiar with the principles. Now, very early on, in the earliest experiments for screw propulsion, obviously a lot of the ships were being used with either very small or actually boats, but the very earliest propeller shafts would have been continuous from the engine to the propeller, and usually, made out of iron, but there are occasions in the very earliest days where they were just made out of wood, just a big wooden dowel, essentially. But these things have their disadvantages. It's a little bit more difficult to seal them. Wood is a lot more flexible, more likely to wear quite quickly. And you have the slight problem of, obviously, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if your propeller is chucking a bunch of water backwards, then the force that generates pressing forwards, which is the force that actually moves your ship through the water, gets pressed into the engines, and thus anything larger than a few knots on a relatively small ship, that force is just going to shove the propeller shaft right into the engine and destroy it. Now, of course, in the very early days, when you're talking about low RPM, low pressures, low speeds, smaller craft, and engines that tend to be built out of monolithic iron construction, that's not as much of a problem. But the minute anyone tries to get a particularly large, particularly fast, etc. engine going, and therefore a large ship propelled through the water, there are issues, particularly with wearing away the propeller shaft, because they do figure out maybe we need to brace it a little bit or clamp it, but the prop shafts then wear away. And this means that if you look up lists of patents, you'll find in 1845 there is a patent for what is essentially a thrust block. If you read through it, you recognize pretty much all the major components. And a thrust block is essentially a compartment which is small compartment, or cabinet, I guess you could call it if you want to be very crude, bolted to the ship, or attached to the ship, however you want, usually rivets or bolts at this period. And this contains a rotating disc, which it also contains a lot of very high pressure oil or other lubricant early on. And the propeller shaft is then made up of segments. This is USS Texas's propeller shaft, just in case you're interested, or one of them. And as you can see, being made up of segments, those segments can have these circular flanges, and one of those circular flanges would then sit inside the thrust block. So the propeller rotates, the propeller shaft gets pushed back into the ship, but instead of the propeller shaft being shoved into the engine, you have this flange of the propeller shaft pressing up against the disc that is, obviously it has a hole in it, looks like a giant donut within the thrust block, And you'd think, well, that creates a very large surface area for friction. That's where the highly pressurized oil comes into place. So that allows a transfer of force without a huge amount of friction. And of course, if you transfer the force into the thrust block, then that gets transferred into the ship, and thus the ship moves forward, and thus the engine isn't destroyed. That's 1845. That's 15 years before the first ironclad ship. It is almost but not quite before the deployment of screw-propelled warships of any significant size, and certainly before the deployment of most of them. And at that point, because obviously you need this flange on the prop shaft in order to use the thrust block properly, you've also got to the stage where you have essentially three components to a propeller shaft. So you have the shaft that is an integral component of the engine, and that can be solid, but very often will be hollow. You have the intermediate shaft, and that is basically what connects the engine and its immediate shaft to the propeller. And this can be any number of sections. It can be one section, it can be multiple sections bolted together. And then you have the final shaft, the actual bit that connects to the propeller at the other end, the bit that goes through the gland and sticks out into the water. So you could have three sections with just the one intermediate block. You could have 10 sections with 8 intermediate blocks, just depends how long you want the shaft to run. And the reason they make them hollow is, well, multiple reasons. Firstly, it makes the whole thing lighter and therefore more practical. Secondly, it actually makes things slightly stronger, because hollow objects can be stronger than solid objects under certain forms of tension, like severe torsion. And thirdly, it also allows for cooling. So again, you look at some of the patents from the 1840s and 1850s, some of the descriptions as well, and they mention things like passing cold water through the hollow of the propeller shaft, which helps to cool the propeller shaft, because there will still be, friction, which will cause things to heat up. And that becomes more of an issue the faster that ships want to go, because if you are, the Napoleon, the first steam battleship, but a wooden vessel, the RPM on that is a lot lower than the RPM on, say, a 1880s cruiser, which might want to be going 4 or 5 times as quickly. And essentially, once that general form of propeller and thrust block has been settled in the 1840s and early 1850s, it's just variations on that theme. Are we making it out of iron? Are we making it out of steel? What are we lubricating it with? Oil? Are we lubricating it with whale oil? Are the bearings made of finely crafted steel ball bearings with oil lubrication? Are they of lignum vitae, very hard but self-lubricating wood? Essentially, people are just playing around with the minor features of a general setup that pretty much is still in use today. If the gods had wanted us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh Look Mead asks, can you briefly-ish explain how does centralized fire control for anti-aircraft guns work, and how does it affect anti-aircraft fire? Essentially, centralized fire control for anti-aircraft guns in the Second World War is an attempt to solve the problem of actually directing anti-aircraft fire in an accurate manner. And that comes down to 2 primary factors. Firstly, anti-aircraft guns need to fire quite a lot, very often, and therefore there's going to be near constant vibration. This makes placing any kind of fire control system on or in a particular anti-aircraft gun mount, depending on its size, somewhat difficult, because electromechanical systems are highly sensitive to shock and vibration. And you've also got the fact that in World War II, accurate fire control calculations are done by relatively large electromechanical systems. So they take up a lot of space, and they also weigh a fair amount, which means that even if you look at, say, something like a 5.25-inch twin or a 5-inch 38 twin mount, something with a fair amount of internal volume, There are still restrictions on available space. There's still quite a lot of shock and vibration, and there's a considerable weight implication, because if you've got 8 or 10 installations and you're going to give each one of those a fully spec'd fire control system, which is going to include range finding, etc., that's going to substantially add to the weight of your total anti-aircraft suite, which they may then restrict the number of anti-aircraft guns you've got, which is kind of a bit self-defeating. The idea of a centralized fire control system, therefore, is that if you have fewer, larger range-finding systems and the associated fire control computers, you can therefore get big, essentially premium units with very high fidelity, at least what counts for high fidelity for the time. And by being slightly clear of the anti-aircraft guns themselves, they're less vulnerable to the aforementioned shock and vibration issues. And you can also position them relatively high in the ship, because there's relatively few of them, so they're not going to have so much of an impact on the ship's stability, and therefore they can get a better view and a better idea of what's going on. They can track aircraft even perhaps before the aircraft come strictly into view of a particular gun, which is quite useful because, one, you can start calculating your fire control solution, and two, obviously because you have to lead the shot, you can then have a fire solution locked in for an aircraft that the gun can't see, but you might still want to fire that gun, because by the time the shell reaches out, the aircraft will now be in view of the gun, and thus, obviously, hopefully you'll get a hit. So it ends up acting essentially like a much more complicated, much faster moving version of central fire control for the battleship's main guns. I say faster and more complex because obviously the situation is evolving a lot quicker. You have to fire a lot more rapidly, but also it's more complex because you're having to work in a third dimension, because obviously aircraft can move up and down as well as, left and right, forward and back, the way that ships can. Ships being mostly working on the sea surface and therefore removing that vertical element to a certain degree. And much like with a battleship's main guns, the particular centralized fire control system, because you will have multiple to cover multiple arcs to engage different aircraft and as backups, etc., each one of these systems will know where it is, where the data it's getting is located on the ship, and where the individual anti-aircraft sections that it's controlling are. And obviously, again, like with the main guns, it can then make adjustments for the trigonometry of that if it's aiming at a particular target. And the point of the whole thing is to put down a barrage of fire onto a particular target or a particular volume where a target is going to be by the time the shells get there. Because for the most part, right up until the very end of World War II, even a big centralized fire control system is not going to be accurate enough to reliably say, right, we're going to take control of a single heavy anti-aircraft gun, or even a battery of medium anti-aircraft guns, and we're going to fire a shell and we're going to hit a target. Because, to be honest, even if the fire control solution was perfectly correct, obviously there's a pilot on that aircraft. They may change course and speed, etc., whilst the shell is in flight. So the idea is instead, especially with VT fuses, or just time fuses, you just fill a volume with shrapnel and hope that some of it hits. And the more guns that you can point in that direction, the better, because there's more shrapnel occupying a larger volume, therefore greater chance that your target will be taken down. The slightly odd thing as far as anti-aircraft guns go is that by the time you get to the very end of World War II, with the advent of smaller, more compact radar and smaller, more compact calculation devices, there was a trend towards individual anti-aircraft mounts getting their own fire control systems. So you look at, say, Vanguard, and each of her sextuple 40mm Bofors has its own ranging and miniature fire control system, although a central system that can act at much longer range for things like the 5.25-inch armament in that case is still present. And then you get to the jet era, right at the end of the Channel's period of coverage, and suddenly the whole situation has got far faster and far more complex, and you actually see, to a certain amount, a reversion back to central fire control because of the need for, once again, higher fidelity, faster calculating, more precise fire control units, and then you get into the Cold War, past the Channel's period of coverage, where you start to get missiles that are self-guiding, and the whole thing kind of gets very confusing. One thing it is important to point out, however, at this point, is that in order for central fire control for anti-aircraft guns to work properly, you really need remote power control and elevation for the anti-aircraft guns in question. You can, in theory, do it battleship main gun style, follow the pointer, but if you want the system to actually work with a reasonable degree of efficiency, you essentially need that fire control system to be able to train and elevate the guns remotely with electrical or hydraulic controls, at which point the anti-aircraft gun crews are just in charge of feeding it ammo. Sage of Irrelevance asks, if Admiral Togo had not died of throat cancer in 1934, but had instead lived for another decade in relatively good health, what impact would he have had on the pre-war Imperial Japanese Navy and on the conduct of the Pacific War, if any? I think he would have been something of a Schrodinger's admiral, because, if he continues to live past 1934 and into the early part of the Second World War, he's going to be in his late 80s for the latter part of the 1930s, and then in his early 90s during the Second World War. That in and of itself is going to limit him quite a bit, just through simple age, plus the fact that unlike the generation of Japanese military officers that came to the fore in the 30s and 40s, who for the most part were as much politicians as they were officers or were forced into that role, Togo hated the idea of politics in general, and he came from an era when that wasn't really so much the case, and by that point both being retired and so much of a famous national figure, he could also afford to not be political and just sort of look down in disdain at everybody else. But with so much political involvement in the way that things were run in late 30s, early 40s Japan, he therefore wouldn't really have had too much of a voice if he had continued to conduct himself in the way that he did in his final years in history. But the reason I say he'd be a Schrodinger's admiral is that he was still immensely respected by everybody. Much as the army and the navy in Japan did their level best to try and murder each other, sometimes literally, Togo was pretty much the one figure that every military person in Japan agreed was worthy of utmost respect, and even the Imperial Japanese Army respected Togo, which means that if he had broken with his habit and actually made some kind of pronouncement on things, he actually would have been taken fairly seriously, at least for a while. Of course, the flip side to that is it's entirely possible that someone might turn around and go, well, I guess he needs to be assassinated. That was not exactly off the cards at that time. So there is a remote possibility that Togo might turn around and substantially change the way that things were going at that time period, but it's relatively speaking unlikely, simply because it would require a complete change in the nature of Togo, at which point we're not really talking about Togo, we're talking about a 1930s political military officer who happens to have Togo's clout. Andrew Dederer asks, World War I looks to have been the driver of, and the Washington Treaty seems to have cemented the transition from coal to oil, with coal only showing up in treaty designs as an armour cheat. Given such evident advantages, especially in terms of range and refuelling time and capability, what would an early conversion of either the High Seas Fleet or the Grand Fleet have had on World War I? And is it enough to change the balance of power? So a pre-war conversion fully of their fleets from coal to oil burning would have had a fairly decisive effect on the First World War, that is true, but not in the way that you think. If the Germans had done it, it would have ensured pretty much the uselessness and or defeat of the High Seas Fleet in very short order, and if the Royal Navy had done it, it would have massively limited Royal Navy operations and or made the certain Atlantic convoys massively more important. Allow me to explain. The problem was that oil production in 1914 was massively lower than it was in 1939, and we know how much of a problem the Kriegsmarine and the Regimarine had with oil supplies in World War II. So take into account that in World War I, the High Seas Fleet has a lot more ships than the Kriegsmarine ever had, and there's basically zero oil production in continental Europe, except of any significant size, except for Romania. And Romania is either neutral or on the Allied side for the bulk of the First World War. Now, granted, in the historic timeline, Germany does end up forcing Romania to cede its oil right at the very end, but that's not really going to help you for the first few years. Which means that if the entirety of the High Seas Fleet, from submarines through destroyers, cruisers, battle cruisers, and battleships, is burning oil, they are going to have massively chronic fuel shortages, which means they can deploy very rarely, which in turn means that the Royal Navy can do pretty much whatever it likes for most of the First World War, just occasionally having to pop up when the Germans look like they might have built their oil reserves up to a point they can afford to venture outside of the Jade Estuary. The flip side for the British is that the British themselves, they haven't discovered the North Sea oil fields at this stage. They do have a little bit of access to oil from various smaller oil fields under their control across the world, although a good number of those haven't been developed anywhere near as much as they would be later on. But they do also have access to the single biggest oil producer of the 1914 to 1918 period, that being the USA, albeit obviously they have to pay for it and then they have to safely transport it across the ocean, hence why I mentioned convoys would be very important. So unlike the Germans, if the Royal Navy was entirely dependent on oil fuel, they could, in theory, at massive expense, actually source the oil that they needed for operations. But it, as I said, it would be colossally expensive, very fraught with danger. You can pretty much guarantee that oil convoys would become priority targets for German U-boats. But if the Royal Navy was able to maintain that supply, which is in and of itself a little bit questionable, but assuming that it was and it is within the realms of possibility, then they would have something of an advantage, because when you look at, say, the R-class battleships, not only can, as you mentioned, can you refuel quicker and cleaner and easier, but when the R's were supposed to be either coal burning or partially coal burning, because coal with oil spray was pretty much the standard at that point, they were supposed to be 21-knot ships, and simply converting them to oil burners because of the greater energy density of oil meant that you got them up to around 23 knots at their baseline. Obviously, speed dropped off as things were added and time went on through to the Second World War, but it would mean that everything that the British had would receive a slight speed boost if it wasn't already purely oil-fired, and also theoretically a slight manpower requirement reduction, because you don't need stokers shoveling loads and loads of coal into the boilers when you've got pumps just doing the oil, which might alleviate manpower shortages a tiny amount. Eric Van Dooting asks, can you discuss the location and protection of the aviation gasoline storage tanks on the Yorktown-class carriers? How much of a risk was there of a well-placed bomb hitting and potentially causing the tanks to detonate? The primary aviation gasoline storage tanks on a Yorktown-class carrier are found in the bow, right down really, really deep. We're talking basically as close to the bottom of the ship as you can get. If you look at the booklet of general plans, you'll see that the vast majority of these storage tanks are based on the hold level, so that is the absolute lowest level of the ship that's actually accessible, because below that there's just framing and fuel oil. And then as you come up to the second platform level, you have the upper part of those gasoline tanks, and immediately behind that you have a bomb storage, so the ship's magazines. And just forward of that is literally the finer points of the bow. So if you're looking at this picture of Hornet, of Yorktown, sorry, which you can see here, the gasoline storage tanks start roughly, if you follow from the bow, you can see below the flight deck, the actual hull of the ship, you can see there's like a kind of step up before it, and then it goes along, and then it steps down again for the open hangar. Roughly where that step up starts, and just forward of it, is where the gasoline storage tanks will begin, and they'll continue after a little bit. And then as you keep going up on the plans, you get to the first platform deck, and you discover that the gasoline tanks are protected because immediately above them is the 5-inch propellant charges for the anti-aircraft guns. So, yeah. And then above that you have ship stores, and then above that you have the wardroom, and then above that you have ammunition hoists, passages, catapult machinery, etc. And then above that you're finally into the hangar spaces. So yeah, really nice and deep in the forward part of the ship. Now, as far as protection goes, there is some armor over the magazines and therefore also over the aviation tanks. It's not a huge amount, but it is there. And of course, there is a little bit of side protection as well, albeit that the tanks do run up to quite close to the side of the hull. There is some spacing, obviously, and they are below water, but there is a small risk. So how much of a risk is there of a well-placed bomb hit potentially causing the tanks to detonate? It depends who the threat is, and it depends what time the ship is facing this threat. The average Japanese 550-pound bomb, whilst when you look at the hits that both Yorktown and Hornet sustained, and even Enterprise for that matter, a Japanese 550-pound semi-armor piercing bomb could get disturbingly deep into the ship. It's relatively unlikely with the, admittedly, not massive, but still there, levels of protection that the tanks have, that it's relatively unlikely such a bomb would get to them or fragments would get to it. The armor will probably protect you against that. However, if you were to suffer a very near miss, that might be a problem. A torpedo hit definitely could rupture the tanks. Or if you were unlucky enough to get hit by one of those converted 16-inch shells, that almost certainly has the armor penetration capability to get down into the avgas tanks. And of course, if you put a Yorktown class in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, general European theatre, then you have 1,000-pound and 2,200-pound bombs being carried by the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica. Those could definitely get down there. So, in her historical threat environment, it's relatively unlikely that a bomb hit will get there, unless it's one of those 1,600-pounders. But in a European theatre, which is a contemporary theatre of threat, then a well-placed bomb hit could get there. Now, as for whether or not that would cause the gasoline tanks to detonate, this is where the time period comes in. If, for sake of argument, the minute the US entered the war, they for some reason sent a Yorktown class on a Malta convoy run, and it got hit in the bows by a 2,200-pound bomb lobbed by a Stuka, then yeah, the gasoline tanks are probably going to go boom at that point. I mean, you'd probably be fairly worried about the adjacent magazines also going boom, but very big boom. Hollywood-style boom, because of course Hollywood booms are usually just large amounts of gasoline that have been set on fire. But if you fast forward a year or so, or even 6 months, so bypass Coral Sea, and everyone's learned from Lexington that maybe you should have inert gas in the fuel circulation system and around the tanks in the event that you're under attack, then the risk of fire and explosion goes down considerably. It's not entirely removed because, of course, this is in the fuel systems and surrounding the tanks. If a 2,200-pounder drops in directly to the tanks and just blows them apart, it's probably not going to help you all that much. but the risk of an adjacent hit or a near miss setting off the gasoline tanks is massively reduced. So in the overall World War II threat environment, yes, there is a risk. In the specific threat environment the Yorktowns face in the Pacific, that risk is considerably reduced, but not zero. But it's still fairly well protected, as compared, especially once the inert gas system is brought in, as compared to some carriers' aviation fuel storage systems. Marlin Stout asks, this may be more of a Wednesday video thing, or even more than one video. Indeed, actually, it will be, as you'll see with the rest of the question later. But if it hasn't already been covered, I've been reading the book The Wager by David Gran. Could you discuss Anson's expedition and the difficulties the ships had getting around Cape Horn, the loss of the Wager, the tribulations of its crew, and the controversy in court-martial that followed? Well, there's really 3 videos in that, to be honest, for a Wednesday, and I do have them planned for a little kind of half-month mini-series at some point, maybe towards the end of this year, beginning of next, because you kind of got to look at Anson's voyage in general, that in and of itself is a video. What happened to the Wager is a completely separate video in and of itself, and then a deeper dive into all the medical issues they ran into and why is a video in and of itself. I've actually got a doctor lined up who can explain that part of things, a proper medical doctor. But nonetheless, leaving aside the Wager for the minute, because that would dominate this entire answer and still not be comprehensive, Anson's voyage generally is kind of a good example of exactly why you needed to solve the longitude problem, because, well, and several other issues. Essentially, if you look at Anson's expedition, it encapsulates every single problem that long-range expeditions in the Age of Sail had, and would soon, actually, in very quick succession, all be solved. So part of the problem was his ships were just overcrowded, and this led to outbreaks of disease, which really didn't help matters, typhus and so forth. Plus, because at this point they hadn't quite cottoned on to the whole, vitamin C, or at least citrus-type stuff to combat scurvy being a thing, it meant that huge amounts of his crew would die of scurvy and related complications. And because he was sailing in an era before Harrison had solved the longitude problem with his clocks, it meant that, as mentioned in the question, when they tried to get around the southern tip of South America, well, if you look at their track charts for that, it looks like wild spaghetti, because they have no idea where they are, really. They have their latitude, but their course is kind of, well, we're at this latitude. If we sail one way or the other, we may run straight into the coast of South America, which we know we don't want to do because it's very rocky and very unforgiving around there. So what they're essentially doing is trying to sail to an appropriate latitude, both to get around the tip of South America and also to find islands which were known where they could make landfall. But of course, because they didn't have the ability to work out their longitude, they would just have to sail up to what they thought was the correct latitude and then make a wild guess as to where along that latitude they were, i.e. do you sail east or west to try and find the island? And repeated attempts at this cause all these weird and wonderful course corrections. The storms don't really help. But it is quite fascinating, actually, once they've, without sounding too callous, once they've lost enough people that the overcrowding isn't so much of a problem, which kind of deals with the typhus outbreak to a certain degree. The fact they took a bunch of pensioners didn't really help either. But nonetheless, you essentially see for the rest of the voyage this pattern of sailing at sea for long periods of time, which the ship is capable of doing, the men are capable of doing, the food and water they have on board is capable of sustaining them physically for that duration. But because they don't have the appropriate amounts of fresh fruit, lime juice, lemon juice, etc., because this hasn't been a solved issue yet, they keep falling victim to massive bouts of scurvy. Then they end up limping ashore to some island or other, which has fresh fruit and vegetables, which build up their vitamin C reserves. Some of them die because they're too far gone. The rest of them spend a month or two building up all their strength. They're all feeling much better. And then they set out again, and it all degrades again. You can almost think of it like an energy bar in a game. The minute you leave the island and your fresh supplies from that island run out, you're now on a ticking clock until everybody gets scurvy, and you have to go hunting for yet another place to try and visit and build up your strength again. Robert Knapp asks, if the Soviets had completed the Savetsky-Soyuz class post-war or the theoretical Stalingrads, what would the Western response have been? Would it have just meant the Iowas, Vanguards and Jean Bart being retained and modernized, or would the response have been more substantial? It depends on which of those two options you take up, and for the sake of argument, we're going to assume that that's for Savetsky-Soyuz is not the ridiculous pie-in-the-sky notion of building 15 of the blasted things. So, if the Soviets complete the Savetsky-Soyuz class, so these are big, not quite, but almost Yamato displacement vessels with slightly less powerful armament, that could be seen as something of a problem, because nothing in the Allied arsenals would be entirely happy with taking them on. The closest you get would be the Iowas, similar level of firepower. The Soyuzes would have heavier armor versus the Iowas having superior speed. So you could potentially see Illinois and Kentucky finished at that point, and or somebody resurrecting the Montanas, because the Montanas would have more firepower, similar speed, and better protection overall. Or some evolved portion of that, perhaps one of the battleship designs that they were looking at after the Montana was cancelled could be revived. The British, if the Americans are going to build, 4 Montana or Montana Mark IIs or something like that, which is probably the top-end response, the British will probably also have to respond because, Vanguard is faster, but not as well armed. The King George V's are roughly the same speed, competitively protected, but nowhere near as well armed either. The British government is obviously very strapped for cash, but we do know you do have, the 1945 battleship and various iterations on the Lion class being looked at. If they absolutely have to, push comes to shove, the British will probably build 1 or 2, probably 2 evolved Lion types. Exactly what those are going to be, I have no idea. There were so many weird and wonderful designs up there at that point, but they would pretty much have to. Assuming, of course, that the Savetsky-Soyuzes actually work and don't just fall apart 5 seconds into launch. But the Stalingrads are perhaps a little bit more interesting because they're not quite as big and mean and terrible as the Soyuzes are on paper, but they are quite quick. Now, in the event of some Stalingrads being completed, it's actually going to be a slightly easier job, I think. The Americans would probably finish Illinois and Kentucky, because although the Stalingrads would be mildly faster than an Iowa, they're nowhere near as heavily armed or as heavily protected. So 6 Iowas, which means you can then have at least 2 or 3 on call at any point, would be quite a strong counter to any reasonable number of Stalingrads. For the Royal Navy, the speed is going to be the biggest issue. A King George V versus a Stalingrad in a straight-up fight, assuming both sides actually stay in range, is a fairly easy win for the King George V because, well, look at Duke of York versus Scharnhorst, except the Stalingrads are even worse protected. But the Stalingrads can run rings around a King George V. Vanguard is a much better ship to take on Stalingrad. It's still not as fast, but it is substantially faster than a King George V. The 15-inch guns can still utterly murder a Stalingrad, and it's still got good protection. So you could potentially see an evolved Vanguard or 2 being constructed. Maybe 2 so that you have 3, including Vanguard, on rotation, and the King George V's get ditched. Again, this is assuming the UK government can scrape together the money to pay for it. in either scenario, taking on the Soyuzes or the Stalingrads, Jean Bart is actually a relatively decent bet. I mean, she'll be at disadvantage versus a Soyuz, but she still has the speed to be able to at least remove herself from the engagement if it starts to go badly, and she has that all-forward armament, which is quite handy. So those would be kind of the optimal responses from the Western powers. Of course, there is a chance that depending on when these things are completed and the relative budgets that everybody has, that you might just see Vanguard and Jean Bart being the British and French contributions to things, and just a couple of extra Iowas, the Illinois and Kentucky, being completed. Which, to be fair, at that point you're talking about 8 fast battleships with, decent firepower against potentially 4 Soyuzes or 3 or 4 Stalingrads. That's still going to be more than enough to counter them. SDF7 asks, watching episode 286 of the Dry Dock as you elaborated on the reasons for the period covered by the channel, my tangential thought stream couldn't help but wonder the following. As a US citizen and a decided layman, it appears to me that after the period of the channel, more and more information was, and remains, classified. Even things that explicitly were to be declassified by this point often are not. So, as an actual historian who peruses National Archives, 1, do you perceive this to actually be true? Is it mostly a US government thing, or does it hold true across Western governments? And 2, if the first item holds true, what impact do you think this will have on the ability of historians to actually determine what happened by getting to real sources instead of sanitized for the public information, especially as documents become the only sources available with the passage of time? Are we moving into an era where perpetual classification and data hiding will prevent academic analysis outside of internal services or internal government review? There is a definite trend to classify more and more stuff at source over the course of the 20th century. I mean, as I've covered for the channel's time period, in the 1890s, pretty much almost everything about naval warfare, including warship design, the latest features of the latest guns, etc., was not quite open source, but it was, a lot of it was very much public domain. And then as the naval arms races that would culminate in the First World War gradually began to ramp up, you began to see things becoming more and more classified, less and less details being released to the public. Then, by the time of the Second World War, you get to a point where the actual appearance of various ships wasn't known until either, if it was ships in your own country, they were spotted at a naval review or at a dockyard. And for ships in other countries, especially if they wanted to be a bit secret squirrel, like Japan with the Yamatos, it could take years to find out exactly what the capabilities of such vessels were. And of course, everybody is putting out effectively the Intel version of chaff to disrupt people from finding out what's actually going on. So, you have perfectly sane-sounding intel reports from 1941 about the Japanese, which are talking about them building 12-inch armed supercruisers, and that there are a number of these in service. There aren't, and there never would be, but that's what Intel believed. And of course, mixed in with that is other intel that we now know is actually accurate, but at the time, how do you pick out which is accurate and which isn't? And this trend to classify or restrict almost everything continues to get progressively larger and larger throughout the Cold War. So more and more stuff is hidden away in the first place. But also the longevity of systems means that things stay classified for longer. Because if you think about it, if somebody wanted to classify, say, the layout of a London-class pre-dreadnought, well, in 20 years' time, the London-class pre-dreadnoughts were beyond obsolete. So at that point, nobody would care if the details of that particular vessel were made public. Whereas nowadays, you look at, say, a Nimitz-class supercarrier, understandably, these things are still in frontline active service, and therefore a good portion of what exactly goes into them is still classified. But as a design, not going from the in-service date of Nimitz, but as from when the design was formalized, In the next couple of years, that design is going to turn 60, but it's still considered frontline, whereas 60 years old at the time of the Washington Naval Treaty would be like somebody panicking over the release of the design data for HMS Warrior, the first ironclad, not even the armoured cruiser. Or someone in the middle of World War II throwing a bit of a panic because German or Japanese agents have stolen the plans for the Admiral-class ironclads, or the Victoria-class, the one that got rammed and sunk by Camperdown. That's the kind of timescale we're talking about. So, obviously in World War II, by World War II, no one cared in the slightest that ironclad designs were out there in the public domain, or pre-dreadnought designs, or even early dreadnought designs. But that only goes back, 20, 25 years at that point. Whereas for the Royal Navy, for example, the relatively recent Type 45 destroyers, their design is already older than that. And you can bet your bottom dollar there's good chunks of the Type 45's design that's still staying classified for a long time. And then you could look at, say, for example, the Falklands War. If in the 2000s you tried to tell everyone that the Royal Navy had used laser weapons on Argentine pilots in 1982, people would have thought you're probably a little bit cooked in the head. But then in the early 2010s, it turns out that the Royal Navy did deploy a form of laser weapon, specifically, at least according to the files that were released at that time, a laser dazzle system, rather than a Death Star style thing, to obviously try and deter Argentine pilots, although according to that particular release, it was never used. Now, of course, the way these things tend to be declassified in stages, admitting that they have a system is one thing, so we've got past that stage. But then, if that system was ever used on enemy pilots in 1982, I can pretty much guarantee you that we won't know for certain either way until probably at least the mid-2030s, possibly later. And then, of course, that brings up the question of, well, if the Royal Navy was deploying a laser dazzle system in 1982, did it continue to have a laser dazzle system? Did it continue to upgrade laser dazzle systems? Do current Royal Navy ships deploy some advanced version of laser dazzle systems on their vessels? We're never going to be told, not for decades to come. And that's before you get thoroughly stupid reclassification programs like what I've mentioned earlier with regards to anything containing the word nuclear at one point being reclassified in the US. And if you want to see how effective this kind of stuff can be, just look at Ultra, the Allied interception and decryption of German communications in World War II. Until that came out, every credible history book and account written about the war talked about intelligence intercepts and spies, because that would be the only way some of this information could come about, it was thought, without the admission that, we'd managed to create an early computer and crack German Enigma broadcasts. And, if YouTube was around back in the 70s and 80s, that's what we would have to say, because that's what all the evidence pointed to. And then it turns out that's completely wrong. There was this massive decryption effort going on. Now that's common knowledge. But that was a very, very well-kept secret. And, as we know, there is still stuff even for World War II, like exactly what happened with HMS Glorious, which is still under classification. So, yeah, I do think it's going to restrict going forward what historians of the more recent past, at least in naval terms, can actually say with, good faith accuracy going forward. Because I suspect there's an awful lot of stuff that probably won't be released by various governments until everybody involved in it is dead. And considering the way you have political and military dynasties going on, you may well then have people blocking the release of those documents until they are also dead, even though they might be the sons, daughters, cousins, nephews, sponsors, favourite protégés of the people who were originally involved. Lord Quack, King of the Ducks, asks, the industrial production capabilities of the US during World War II are well known and played a huge role in the war, especially in naval matters. But what was the capability and plan for the US Navy during World War One if the war had gone on? Obviously, US involvement in World War One was considerably shorter than its involvement in World War Two, but assuming that World War One extended into 1919, maybe 1920, would we be memeing about 3D printer shipyards and huge numbers of ships the Navy launched, or was the industrial base just not there yet for World War II levels of production? And if the Navy was filled out in the way it was during World War II, what would a 1919 or 1920 US fleet look like? US production capability in the 1910s was quite large, but it wasn't quite at the level that you had during World War II. Because bearing in mind, the modern production line manufacturing methods were relatively recently applied in industry by the time of World War One. And so the kind of industrial scale, hey, we're going to build an entire shipyard and then stick 50 escort carriers on it, and we're going to do all of that inside of a year or two, levels of insanity which you get in the World War II US, that's not quite within 1910s US industrial capabilities just yet. Now, the US does have quite a large naval production capacity still. I mean, look at how many Wicks and Clemson classes that were built during the latter part of the 1910s. And then you look at, suddenly going from building a couple of capital ships a year to 6 Lexingtons and 6 South Dakotas shortly after the end of World War One. So there was a degree of upscaling that the US could do, but not quite to the degree that they did in World War II, and certainly not in that time period. Because the other thing you've got to remember is that in World War II, the US had just as much warning as everybody else did that things were going south. From the mid-1930s onwards, it was pretty clear something was happening. And on top of that, the US has, from the time the war breaks out in Europe in late 1939 until it's forced to get involved in late 1941 to further up their wartime production facilities. So they've got quite a bit of lead time on that. Whereas, thanks in part to congressional penny pinching, the US Navy really isn't in much of a place to significantly expand production capabilities over a kind of a similar 6 to 7 year period prior to the US Navy's involvement in World War One, i.e. from, let's say, about 1910 onwards. There is some expansion of things, but nowhere near at the same scale. And similarly, much as we like to talk about the Essex Swarm, as I've pointed out before, the first wave of the Essex Swarm was laid down before the US got involved in the Second World War and only came online after the US had been directly involved in the war for about a year and a half. The US coming in 1917 means that if you were going to have a huge and hilarious US capital ship fleet of whatever flavor coming into service in, let's say, late 1919, they would have had to start laying down said hilarious fleet in early 1917 before they got involved in the war. And we know historically that that wasn't the case. And they also didn't do that in 1918. In theory, if the war stretched all the way to the end of 1920 and, let's say, in mid-1918, the US just threw up its hand and said, stuff it, we're building a ton of stuff, the big capital assets still wouldn't be ready in time to meaningfully take part in the war. You'd just be looking at, more destroyers and other escort vessels of a Wicks and Clemson class size range. And maybe you can get some cruisers in there as well, if you're really quick off the mark and the war does last through to 1920. But there just hasn't been the run-up and lead-up time and orders placed by 1918 for the US to meaningfully get a kind of World War II level of spam out. A Buord certified American tourist, formerly known as Gabriel A. Hawkins, asks, did the Washington Naval Treaty limit seaplane tenders? As seaplane facilities take up space and weight, they're unwieldy, and they constitute a damage control liability when placed on a surface warship. To this end, might it have made sense for various navies to build a few large, high-speed seaplane tenders with an eye toward not placing seaplanes on their cruisers and battleships? I realise the Japanese did build large seaplane tenders, and they did so as a means of planned conversion into carriers and sort of sidestepping the treaty, as opposed to directly intending to improve the performance of their own cruisers and battleships. Technically speaking, no, seaplane tenders were not restricted by the Washington Naval Treaty. I mean, you've got the definition of an aircraft carrier, which is specifically a vessel over 10,000 tons that aircraft can be launched and landed upon, which means that, well, obviously you've got the Japanese trying to rule dodge that one with Ryujo. So technically, if you built a seaplane tender that was under 10,000 tons, that would be completely unlimited by the treaty, as long as you didn't armor it enough for it to be considered a cruiser. And if you really wanted to be rules lawyery about it, technically there's nothing stopping you building an aircraft carrier or a seaplane tender above 10,000 tons, because, at least if you're just looking at the definition of aircraft carrier, because if it was over 10,000 tons, but a seaplane tender is designed to recover aircraft from the sea, so it might have the ability to launch aircraft, but not for the ability for aircraft to land on it. The only problem with that is there's a separate part of the treaty that says that everybody commits not to build any warship over 10,000 tons that isn't an aircraft carrier or a battleship. So, yeah, with those in mind, you could build a 9,999 ton seaplane tender and technically build as many of them as you like. I suppose in theory that would mean you could build, a large cruiser-sized vessel, in fact probably larger than a cruiser, because you probably aren't going to be putting heavy armor, and you're certainly not going to be putting heavy armament on it, which could then carry, maybe a dozen, 24 seaplanes or float planes, which could then become your kind of central recon hub for the fleet, and obviously with speed to keep up with the rest of the fleet. I suspect at that point, however, the main issue would be cost. So in the 20s, everybody is being relatively cost conscious, and even in the early 30s. And constructing, half a dozen 10,000-ish ton vessels on top of your cruiser construction, etc., that would be a fair bit of money. Although, given the time period, the idea of such a large fast seaplane tender acting as your scouting base isn't necessarily awful, but I think a lot of people would probably object to it on the grounds that it would be a big, expensive target traveling with the fleet that then can't really defend itself in any particular way and is therefore quite vulnerable. But and compared to that, the idea of just sticking some catapults and maybe a hangar or two on an existing warship, which gives it the ability to do all of this by itself wherever it happens to be, is also going to be a lot cheaper than building a separate dedicated vessel. Because that's the other thing, I think, especially for the British, maybe not so much for the Japanese or the Americans, is that such a vessel concentrates all your scouting capability onto a single hull, which relies on the availability of that vessel or one of its class, and means that you're kind of restricting your admittedly relatively extensive scouting capability at that point to a fleet, rather than each individual largish war vessel being able to do it itself wherever it happens to be. But as I said, particularly for the Royal Navy, where they're looking at big cruiser squadrons or even single cruisers on detachment, that's quite important. Pedden Harley asks, which service would have benefited more by having a schnorkel available for submarines in mid-1942, the US Navy or the Royal Navy? Definitely the Royal Navy. Now, I'm not saying it wouldn't have been useful for the US Navy. It certainly would have been. However, the US Navy in mid-1942, well, most of their torpedoes aren't working in their submarine fleet anyway, but two, even if they were, thanks to the sheer size of the Pacific and the rather impressive capabilities of the fleet subs, the US submarine forces are generally able to remain submerged during the day when they need to, and come to the surface to recharge at night when they need to, and even run on the surface during the day when they're not in close contact with the enemy. So whilst having a schnorkel would perhaps allow a little bit more of an aggressive push in certain areas, it would only be a kind of a niche speciality item for a lot of the time. Whereas the Royal Navy,
in mid-1942 is having to deal with the Mediterranean, the Atlantic East Coast, the North Sea. All of these areas are much closer to enemy coastlines. There's a lot more enemy aerial reconnaissance. Italian and German anti-submarine warfare technology and efforts are generally a lot more widespread and a lot more competent than the Japanese versions are. And so all of that means that anything that can keep a submarine below the water substantially would be exceptionally useful, particularly in the Mediterranean, where, as was seen multiple times, even being caught on the surface was bad enough, but even if you managed to detect an enemy coming in quickly enough to diving to a relatively shallow depth still might not save you. Whereas, obviously, if you have a snorkel system fitted, then you don't have to surface. Your boat is already in diving condition, bar the snorkel. And if you do notice an enemy destroyer or aircraft heading your way, you can just go, okay, down snorkel, switch over to batteries, we're going deep. And hopefully by the time the enemy arrives, you're deep enough not to be detected. So yeah, basically the combination of the theatre and the competence of the ASW forces arranged against it would mean the Royal Navy would have far more use for the snorkel in mid-42 compared to the US Navy. Connor Johnson asks, many sailing merchant ships had several smaller sails rather than fewer larger sails found on warships. I know the main reason was to cut down on crew requirements, as a small sail needs less people to handle than a big one, but are there any other advantages to this layout, and why wasn't it common on warships? Beyond the smaller crew requirements, there aren't that many advantages of having lots and lots of smaller sails. About the only other ones that I can really think of would be, firstly, when automatic sail furling and motor assistance and so forth starts to come in. Obviously, given that you're talking about the very early beginnings of those kinds of electrical systems, you don't need as big or powerful units to help you haul in small sails as you would for big sails, so it allows you to bring those in earlier, which obviously further reduces your need for crew. And of course, if a sail blows out and it's a small one, it's going to be quicker and easier to replace than if a really big sail lets go. So for the same number of, or the same square meterage of sailcloth that you carry with you, you can replace and repair more blown out small sails. But outside of that, I mean, you look at this ship, disregarding the number of masts, because this is a late 19th century vessel, but look at how many yard arms there are. Every single one of those requires rigging to help it stay up. In and of itself is a weight as well, and each of those sails obviously requires rigging as well. So it's a much less efficient in terms of overall weight versus propulsive power, because there's a lot more static dead weight that's needed to support all of these individual sails. Plus, of course, as you can see, there's lots of little gaps between each sail, which means, you know, each of those gaps is wind going through, which is escaping, which isn't propelling your ship. Whereas if you took one of these masts and this was a more conventional age of sail warship, you can pretty much combine the two lowest sails. That would be then your coursing sail, then combine the next two sails, then combine the next two sails. So instead of having 6 sails and 6 yard arms, you'd have 3. And that means that, you know, 3 of these gaps are going to be filled, which means you're actually getting more wind into the sails. And so on a warship where you have the additional men, it makes sense to have the better and more efficient sail layout. The Judge 2017 asks, often the lessons of USS Lexington CV2 are credited with fixing and changing US damage control practices after her loss. What lessons were learned, and how did they save ships like Bunker Hill, Franklin, and Enterprise? There were a number of lessons learned, and some of them were also commensurate with lessons learned from the damage to Yorktown in the same battle, particularly those centered around getting everybody trained up in damage control. So, you know, famously for the bulk of the Pacific War, you have the fact that everybody on a US ship is trained to do damage control. That's not strictly the case right at the very beginning of the war, but it is one of the very quick adaptations that they make, which obviously goes on to save a lot of people's lives. But if you look at the damage control report from Lexington after Coral Sea, pretty much everything is to do with gasoline vapors, because despite being torpedoed and bombed repeatedly, there was a reasonable chance of salvaging Lexington in the aftermath of the attack that the Japanese inflicted on her, until the gasoline explosions and fires started, at which point that was pretty much it. So I'll actually read verbatim from the recommendation section of the report, from the war damage report for Lexington at Coral Sea. So it says, as a result of the study of this case, the following recommendations were made for immediate application to Saratoga and, insofar as is applicable, to all other aircraft carriers. 1. Saratoga to keep layer of tanks inboard of gasoline tanks void and filled continuously with inert gas mixture. This step should operate to reduce shock damage to the holding bulkhead in case of a torpedo hit in this area. 2. Saratoga to segregate port and starboard gasoline systems in order to avoid the possibility of pressure being put on a damaged system from an undamaged system. Then on all carriers, 3. In the event of suspicion of gasoline vapors following attack, operate exhaust ventilation in affected compartments as considered practicable. Early operation of these systems should prevent dangerous concentrations of gasoline vapor. 4. Shut down all electrical equipment subject to sparking throughout entire affected area except where it is considered safe and desirable to run exhaust ventilation blowers. And 5. Inspect all vent ducts from spaces involved to guarantee tightness. This should be done periodically before an attack and again after an attack. There's also an addendum at the end. Steps are also taken to ensure the following equipment will be on board each carrier at the earliest possible date. 1. 15 asbestos suits. Yes, asbestos, but it's better than burning to death. 2. 60 Type A rescue breathing apparatus. 3. 1 fog nozzle for each fire plug. So essentially the vast majority of these recommendations are to do with, initially, ensuring that the avgas tanks won't breach, and if they do breach, that they breach into a relatively inert environment. And then if that fails, if the hit is bad enough that gasoline vapors are still permeating through the ship, you obviously ventilate those parts of the ship as quickly as possible and shut down everything that could be a source of ignition. And then, of course, ensuring you've got enough suits and breathing apparatus to conduct damage control in the face of potential fires. This is quite a radical and significant change, especially when you consider how many Japanese aircraft carriers after Coral Sea which were lost in part or potentially in whole from being salvageable to completely unsalvageable wrecks, mostly because of aviation gasoline fires. And then when you look at Bunker Hill, Franklin and Enterprise, and the various hits that they took, you essentially see kind of this happening in action. Because remember, it's not just a hit down in the aviation gasoline tanks, it's also the fact that those gasoline tanks, you have to get that fuel up to the hangar deck to actually fuel the aircraft, and so a whole system is introduced to flush that area with inert gas as well, so you don't end up with fires on the hangar deck spreading via the fuel system down into the aviation gasoline tanks and then causing something like you can see here in the picture with Lexington from occurring. And across those other three, Bunker Hill, Franklin, Enterprise, you see pretty much this system working as intended, because in each case, obviously with Bunker Hill and Franklin in one particular case, with Enterprise a couple of times, in fact more than a couple of times, you get really bad hits up top, which cause absolutely stupendous fires, but ultimately the fires end up being limited to the fuel sources available on the flight deck and in the hangar deck for the most part. And even when that involves, several thousand litres of aviation fuel in aircraft that have caught fire, it doesn't involve several tens or hundreds of thousands of litres of aviation fuel deep in the heart of the ship. And so fundamentally what you end up with is a limited form, in the worst cases, of what happened to Kaga, i.e. stuff burning from the top down. But because it's limited, as long as you can get that under control and form, layers that are defending you against the heat from being able to burn down deeper into the ship, it is possible to enact damage control and salvage the ship. Whereas if these measures hadn't been in place, then certainly with the kind of flight deck and hangar deck fires that you get with Bunker Hill and Franklin, inevitably at some point the fuel system which would have had parts of itself melted and opened up, without that inert gas system, would have had fuel vapors catch fire. Fire would have flashed down into the gasoline tanks, and the ship would have blown apart from the bottom up internally, and that would have been it. So that, more than anything else, was the big lesson. And finally, Logan W. asks, would it be proper to call a warship that burned coal to produce steam and run its engines, like HMS Dreadnought for example, steam-powered or coal-powered? Technically speaking, either would be correct, and the great fun, of course, is I can use either of the Age of Steel HMS Dreadnoughts for this picture, and it's equally correct. Because, of course, coal would then power the boilers, which turn into steam, which power the turbines, which propel the screws. So using turbine-powered, steam power, or coal-powered for the 1906 HMS Dreadnought, or vertical triple expansion engine, steam-powered or coal-powered for the HMS Dreadnought you can see in this picture, are all technically valid. It's just describing different parts of the powertrain. Although, if you want to be pedantic, coal-fired or oil-fired would be more precise if you're talking about the fuel source, whereas steam power, you could, again, if you wanted to be really technical, say steam-driven. You can also use turbine-driven or vertical triple expansion engine-driven at that point. But I think a lot of it would depend on context. So if you were describing a vessel in, say, the 1880s, 1890s, or something like that, so the older HMS Dreadnought like here, coal-powered or coal-fired doesn't really tell you all that much about the ship as a distinguisher, because coal is pretty much the only mainline fuel source at that stage. Whereas there are ships that are, auxiliary steam-powered, and there are ships that are purely sail-powered. So in that context, using steam-powered would probably be the more correct. Whereas once you get to the age of the 1906 HMS Dreadnought, and certainly once you get into her main service career in the 1910s, now you do have ships that are oil-powered, and you have ships that are steam-powered. And admittedly, as with Dreadnought, you have ships that are mostly coal but partially oil-powered. They all use steam, but at that point, the differentiation is much more useful to talk about the fuel source, because by the 1910s, say Adler aside, there aren't that many sail-powered warships around. Whereas, saying a steam-powered battleship, well, they're all steam-powered. Again, it doesn't add anything to the descriptor. Whereas in the 1910s, saying, well, this is a coal-powered vessel and this is an oil-powered vessel, does add something to a descriptor. So, either way is valid, but it very much depends on the context of which precise ship you're talking about. And that brings us to the end of this week's Dry Dock, everyone. Thank you very much for listening. Next week, we will resume regular service with 1 hour Dry Docks until the end of March. We obviously will have another Patreon Dry Dock. And looking at subscriber numbers, in the next few months, we're probably going to hit that 500,000, which is cool. So for the 500,000, I do have a few things planned, but there will be 2 primary things, I think, which will be giving everyone a chance to vote on the outro for the regular Wednesday and Saturday videos. I.e., do you want to keep the robo voice, the kind of holdover back from the ancient days of the beginning of the channel, or some other outro? And I'll be working on a couple of different options for that. The other thing you'll get to vote on is actually the dry dock image. Now, obviously, the good old USS Oregon here is essentially the icon of the dry dock, but there will be a few options ranging from basically keeping the picture but at a slightly better image ratio format with a slightly better title than just some black lettering stuck up there, all the way through to some combo images and so on and so forth. So all of that will be available at the 500,000 subscriber mark. And other than that, we'll see you again in another video. Thanks for listening.